some jobs, like working in hospitals, where every week you have to get tested. It's mandatory. So whether you have symptoms or not. Bill Maher had no symptoms, and the doctors and nurses who were tested positive had no symptoms, and they weren't shedding viruses.
Really?
Yeah,
well, because
they were not shedding. They were not shedding viruses in their breath. You had to stick the thing up into their sinuses to find the viruses, but they were not effectively contagious, even though they had a very mild case of the disease.
My point of it is that's not the same with the flu or the cold. And since we've been doing all these practices with those, is that we have been getting less of that, and it's almost eradicated the flu. And I'm thinking, you know, even if I've had one vaccination, I'm waiting for my second, and I'm still feeling more comfortable wearing a mask, you know?
Yeah, me too. Me too. Absolutely. And we don't know yet what the impact of these variants is going to be. So, you know, I'm going to wait a little while, but, you know, I'm not telling anybody what to do. Steve, thank you for the call. But you know, the bottom line is if you're vaccinated, you have a really, really high level of protection. We'll be right back. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Gretchen Reynolds over at the New York Times has been compiling for the last year or so, maybe a little longer, but I've been noticing it for the last year, some just remarkable statistics and information coming out of peer-reviewed scientific journals about the benefits of very, very small, short amounts of exercise on the quality of life and the lifespan, you know, the ability to survive disease of all of us. Right? Some of the studies were on younger people. A lot of the studies were on people over 50. And I'm talking very small amounts of exercise, like literally 4 minutes of bicycling, or 4 seconds, excuse me, of bicycling really hard on a stationary bicycle, followed by 56 seconds of just relaxing. And doing that 15 times, you know, over a 15-minute period, a couple of times a week. 4 seconds of exercise produce measurable results. It's all over at ThomHartmann.com. We got a new video up for the people who are supporters of our program. You can check it out. And welcome back. Gordon in there we go, push the right button. Gordon in Stamford, Connecticut, you are on the air.
Yes, Tom, I was wondering if we could enhance the conflict of interest laws so that if any person in Congress has received money from a lobbyist group, they should be compulsorily recused from voting on that subject. That would essentially...
I'm all in favor of that, Gordon. It's like, I'm all in favor of that. I think we should ban lobbying altogether, or at least paid lobbying altogether. You know, if they made you and I emperor of the world for a day or two, we might improve things tremendously. But I don't think it's going to happen next week. But I'm with you. I'm totally with you. And H.R. 1 actually, you know, the For the People Act actually moves in that direction, and at least outs big money, the dark money. Maine in Chicago. Hey, Maine, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, how you doing, Tom? Yeah, I wanted to speak about how we finally got trickled down. I mean, 8 years of Obama. I mean, we talked about this throughout Obama and even before, and here and then now here when Biden said trickle down does not work. Do you know it sounded like my voice had mingled with his when he said the very words trickle down does not work. And when he said,
great minds think alike, man.
Right, and he come from the bottom. When he said we're gonna come from the bottom and out the middle, again it sounded like I heard my voice mingled with his, and that's something else. Now we got to go, like here in Chicago, the redlining. Now they say the redlining is not being used anymore by the financial district. That's the loot and stuff, but the political arm is using it. Mayor Lightfoot has taken the TIF monies, these billions that the TIF get, that the West and South Side gets to build up the neighborhood, but the mayors always take the money and use it for something else. That's why they said she just following suit. She took the last TIF money. That little riot, a little
Maine, I really can't speak to Chicago politics. I'm sorry. I think Mayor Lightfoot is a great person. Everything I know about her, but I'd suggest that this show is followed by Joan Esposito. A local show. You can call in and talk about that there. If you don't mind, but I'm gonna move along. But I think your point on trickle down being dead. Yeah, Joe Biden sounded just like Maine. Just like Maine. Good on you, Maine. Thank you, Arnie in Palm Springs. Hey, Arnie, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I've heard you several times refer to the metric system, and I have something that I thought would be an interesting thing. I was driving with a friend of mine I was driving his car on the New York Thruway, and for some reason we got into a discussion about the metric system, and he was talking about the fact that Americans have this idea of, exactly how big things are and how much they are in the, I guess, the English system, and to come up with a new system would be totally, confusing, and it was just like a pure miracle. But all of a sudden, I saw a sign on the freeway that said "next exit a quarter of a mile," followed immediately by another sign that said "detour 500 yards." And I said, "John, which one is coming first? I got to know." And his wife was sitting in the back seat just laughing like heck, and he didn't talk to me for the rest of the way home.
I can see why. Arnie, you're a smart ass. But you're right. You're right. And we do need the metric system. Thank you very much for that, Arnie. That was a good one. Jim and Skokie. Jim, we have a little less than a minute left. What's up? You got a quick one?
Okay, Tom. Yeah, I got a quick one. It's about, one of my favorite subjects, UFOs. And I want to assure everybody that can hear your radio broadcast, the U.S. government as well as governments all around the world know exactly what's going on with UFOs. It's no mystery. They've been investigating this for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. Go to a website called the Black Vault, where through the FOIA, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of data and printouts from government organizations on this very subject.
Yeah. I'm ready to listen and believe.
One more thing before you finish.
Jim, I'm sorry, I don't have one more thing for you. I'm literally out of time, and I want to acknowledge my staff here every Friday at the end of the day. Special thanks to Louise Hartman, Sean Taylor, Nate Atwell, Jamie Holly, Joyce the Hammer Nance, Nigel Peacock, Sue Nethercutt, Patrick White, Geraldine Halbert, Ron Hartenbaum, Chase Spross, Nicholas Miller, Pat Sweeney, Jabbermochy, and Jay LeBlanc. Thank you for helping me make this program work. Thank you for helping make this program work. Thank you for supporting us. If you're listening on commercial radio, letting our sponsors know. If you're listening on non-commercial radio or television, donating to those causes, thank you. We'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it. Have fun. Be safe.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit ThomHartmann.com.
With chaos in Washington, worsening climate disasters, more wars than we can count, and a wobbling economy.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More information at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. CB Distillery for sleeping and pain relief. More info at CBDistillery.com, code TOM. Annie's Kit clubs, creativity delivered right to your door. More info is available at annieskitclubs.com/Tom. EasyFlow, personal air filtration system. Fresh air anywhere. More info at easyflowusa.com, code TOM. Masterclass with world-class instructors. More info at masterclass.com/Hartmann. And Dinovite, only the best all-natural pet supplements. More info at dinovite.com.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Ezra Klein's new book, Why We're Polarized. This is from the introduction, and it's a couple pages into it. I'm starting out here. I have found that American politics is best understood by braiding two forms of knowledge that are often left separate: the direct on-the-ground insights shared by politicians, activists, government officials, and other subjects of my reporting, and the more systemic analyses conducted by political scientists, sociologists, historians, and others with the time, methods, and expertise to study American politics at scale. On their own, political actors often ignore the incentives shaping their decisions, and academic researchers miss the human motivations that drive political decision-making. Together, however, they shine bright light on how and why American politics works the way it does. There's much awry in American politics, and I won't in this book attempt to catalog all of it. But I've come to believe the master story, the one that drives almost all divides and most fundamentally shapes the behavior of participants, is the logic of polarization. That logic, put simply, is this: to appeal to a more polarized public, political institutions and political actors behave in more polarized ways. As political institutions and actors become more polarized, they further polarize the public. This sets off a feedback cycle. To appeal to a yet more polarized public, institutions must polarize further. When faced with yet more polarized institutions, the public polarizes further, and so on. Understanding that we exist in relationship with our political institutions, that they are changed by us and we are changed by them, is the key to this story. We don't just use politics for our own ends. Politics uses us for its own ends. There are many different types of polarization possible, and I'll discuss some of them later in the book, but the locus of polarization I'll discuss is on political identity. And that requires saying a few words about a term that should be very useful in American politics, but that has become almost useless: identity politics. A core argument of this book is that everyone engaged in American politics is engaged in identity politics. This is not an insult, and it's not controversial. We form and fold identities constantly, naturally. Identity is present in politics in the way gravity, evolution, or cognition is present in politics. That is to say, it is omnipresent in politics because it is omnipresent in us. There is no way to read the literature on how humans form and protect their personal and group identities, literature I will survey in this book, and believe that any of us is immune. It runs so deep in our psyches, so activated so easily by even weak cues and distant threats, that it is impossible to speak seriously about how we engage with one another without discussing how our identities shape that engagement. Unfortunately, the term identity politics has been weaponized. It is most often used by speakers to describe politics as practiced by members of historically marginalized groups. If you're black and you're worried about police brutality, that's identity politics. If you're a woman and you're worried about the male-female pay gap, that's identity politics. But if you're a rural gun owner decrying universal background checks as tyranny, or a billionaire CEO complaining that high tax rates demonize success, or a Christian insisting on nativity scenes in public squares, well, that's just good old-fashioned politics. With a quick sleight of hand, identity becomes something that only marginalized groups have. The term identity politics in this usage obscures rather than illuminates. It's used to diminish and discredit the concerns of weaker groups by making them look self-interested. Special pleading in order to clear the agenda for the concerns of stronger groups, which are framed as more rational, proper topics for normal political debate. But in wielding identity as a blade, we have lost it as a lens, blinding ourselves in a bid for political advantage. We're left searching in vain for what we refuse to allow ourselves to see. All politics is influenced by identity. Those identities are most powerful when they are so pervasive as to be either invisible or uncontroversial. American is an identity. So too is Christian. When politicians, including the irreligious, end speeches with "God bless America," it's not because they're making an appeal to a higher power, but because they're making an appeal to our bedrock identities. If you don't believe me, ask yourself why there are so few open atheists or even agnostics in national politics. This does not mean that politics is an equation solved by locating identity. Identity shapes our worldview, but it does not mechanistically decide it. And while we often speak of identity as a singular, it is always a dizzying plural. We have countless identities, some of them in active conflict with each other, others lying dormant until activated by threat or fortune. Much that happens in political campaigns is best understood as a struggle over which identities voters will inhabit come Election Day. Will they feel like workers exploited by their bosses, or heartlanders dismissed by coastal elites? Will they vote as patriotic traditionalists offended by NFL players who kneel during the national anthem, or as parents worried about the climate their children will inhabit? What we are often fighting over in American politics is group identity and status, fights that express themselves in debates over policy and power, but cannot be truly reconciled by either. Health policy is positive sum, but identity conflict is zero sum. The book Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you, live in my actual studio for the first time in a year and 2 months, or 3 months, since March. April, May. Yeah, okay, there you go. It's incredible. Tomorrow, I'm going to get to my Hartmann Report piece today, which is titled, The Republican Party is Raising the Next Racist Generation of Right-Wing Crackpots. But I'm going to get to it tomorrow because we just have such a jam-packed Monday show today. In our first hour, I want to talk about how life will change dramatically under brutal American oligarchy. The stakes are higher than they've been since the 1860s and the 1930s, and this may be our last chance to rescue democracy in this country. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, is going to be with us from the bottom of this hour, from 12:30 Eastern Time, 9:30 Pacific Time, until the bottom of the next hour. She'll be with us for an hour taking calls, but it'll be a half hour and a half hour. And Dean Obeidallah is going to drop by, and we're going to discuss his Palestinian family living on the West Bank in Israel. Dean Baker is going to be with us about Jerome Powell and the Fed, and that's going to be fascinating. And David Sirota is going to drop by. These are in the, I believe, the Dean Obeidallah will be in our second hour, and Dean Baker, let me just scroll down here, Dean Baker and David Sirota will be in our third hour. So that's what we are, that's what we're up for. There's also, a few things in the news that I think are really worth noting very quickly. The first is that the Israeli bombing of Palestine, or of Gaza, and the Hamas bombing of Israel continues. Israel's using weapons manufactured by Boeing and General Dynamics. And right now there's a $735 million sale of precision-guided weapons from these companies to Israel that's on the verge of passing through. And so we'll see what happens with that. I just wanted to flag that for you. We'll get into that as the week continues. We are sending Israel $3.8 billion a year in military aid. This is a remnant of the Camp David peace accords, Jimmy Carter back in the day. I believe they're the only developed, fully developed country in the world that we're giving this kind, regular aid to, but I may be wrong on that. But in any case, that is something that increasingly is being questioned. And also, it just came out, it was reported in Axios, that Donald Trump, the day after he lost the election, the day after he knew he had lost the election, January 9th, he ordered his generals to get us out of Africa, get us out of Germany, withdraw from Europe, basically, get us out of Iraq and Syria, get us out of Afghanistan. What is this? Turn the world over to Russia or China? It's just like, what's the deal there? But where I wanted to start with this is how life could change. This was my piece that I published over at HartmannReport.com on Saturday. And it's titled, "Life Will Dramatically Change Under Brutal American Oligarchy." And my point is that the Trump presidency gave us kind of a perspective, an insight, a short view, as it were, a glimpse of what American life could be like under a totally authoritarian government. He never got us there, but he sure was trying, selectively deciding which press can come to a White House press conference and calling out the press and all these kind of things. And we're seeing this right now played out in governments around the world where authoritarian strongmen, countries that at one point were democracies, authoritarian strongmen have risen up and largely taken over. I would say that Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Netanyahu in Israel, if he can use this war to pull off, enhancing his political power and keeping himself out of prison, probably falls in that category. Certainly Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, and Duda in Poland. All of these guys increasingly, authoritarian. And the point is that authoritarianism, when you still have a semi-functioning democracy, as is the case with all these countries, that kind of authoritarianism is really just a midpoint. This is not how a government can function over the long term. This is always a transitional phase. You either have a functioning democracy or you have essentially a fascist state. And the way you make that transition is through the path of authoritarianism. And I'm referring to that authoritarianism in the article that I wrote Saturday for HartmannReport.com as oligarchy. And in fact, this is my most recent book, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, lays this out. How this happens, how it works, where it comes from. And this was the sort of thing that the founders of this country, the framers of the Constitution, thought they could protect us from. And it's why they had checks and balances, and why there's two branches of Congress, and all these things. But back in 1911, a political philosopher by the name of Robert Michaels published a book on political parties. And in that book, he created or invented or came up with the phrase, the iron law of oligarchy, his idea that oligarchy was the inevitable result of a democracy if the democracy failed to put into place strong guardrails to protect itself from being overwhelmed by the very rich. That in every single case according to Robert Michaels back in 1911. In every single case where a country had gone from being a democracy to being basically what today we would call fascist, what he was referring to as oligarchy, and what I refer to as oligarchy in my most recent book, in every single case, the path to that oligarchy or fascist state was through authoritarianism, and that path always was paved by very wealthy people. First gaining control of the economy through something very much like monopoly, which is what we have in the United States. Name an industry that's not dominated by fewer than 5 companies. You can't do it. Right? I mean, you know, whether it's, I mean, even obscure things like, you know, arts and crafts, it's, you know, airplane manufacturing, flying, you know, transportation. I pick a, you know, restaurant, pick an industry, and that's what you see. And this corruption of politics happened when the guardrails were taken off in 1976 and 78 by the Supreme Court. And, you know, in their Buckley and Bellotti decisions. And then, of course, they doubled down on that in 2010 with Citizens United. And there's a series of steps that you see in these oligarchic movements as they're moving toward fascism, crushing the rights of women while glorifying a macho ethic. We heard today that the Supreme Court is now going to decide whether, you know, it's okay to basically ban abortion in the United States. Crony capitalism, making the few rich and screwing everybody else. Crushing union efforts, legalizing and widespread promulgation of a police state, basically, that uses selective enforcement of the law. You know, the way that, essentially the way America polices black people. These are all the hallmarks, and this is just the beginning of it. I'll get into a few more on the other side, of that process that we are in and we have to acknowledge.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And if we don't stop this process, if we don't back this thing up, we're in for some serious problems in 2022 and 2024. And welcome back. So, you know, as I was saying, I want to get back to this and just this parts of this list. You know, I mentioned crushing the rights of women, crony capitalism, crushing union efforts, legalizing surveillance, and the sub part of that legalizing surveillance is that the political elites get away with crimes that the average person would go to jail for. Repression of religious minorities is another piece of this. The weaponization of religion as an agent of state power is another piece of this. The marginalization and demonization of minorities, particularly racial and gender-based minorities, is part of this. I mentioned selective enforcement of the laws, so you never know if you're going to be the target of state violence. Example, how America polices black people. Seizures of the courts, so that selectively enforced laws and regulations are used to maintain the power of oligarchs and assuage the insecurities of their, basically their base, their followers. A huge gap. One of the other characteristics of this transition between democracy and oligarchy or fascism is a huge gap between the rich and poor. And this is often accompanied by an explosion of homelessness. And again, you go back and you look at that list of countries I just laid out, and you'll find most of these things are characteristic of every one of them. Civilian paramilitaries who terrorize the population, including the political opposition. Liz Cheney over the weekend made the comment that she knew that there were a number of her Republican colleagues who wanted to vote to impeach Donald Trump the second time around. You know, when it was just irrefutable. And they didn't do it because they feared for their lives. That was her phrase. They feared for their lives. I mean, this is how fascism rises to power. You have the racialization of powerlessness and poverty. Again, another characteristic of a country that is making the transition from democracy into full-blown oligarchic fascism. A brutal grassroots response to those who object to selective poverty, typically leading to the marginalization or even the outright assassination of movement leaders, as happened to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and others. A false form of nationalism. And this is a real key. I mean, the Republican Party is like totally here on this. This was the key to Mussolini's rise to power in the early 1920s. I think it was 24 that Mussolini rose to power in Italy, maybe 1925. Glorifying this mythical past, explicitly covering up the past crimes and failings of the country, and positioning the new oligarchy that this political movement is bringing along as the pinnacle of political evolution, and the corruption of the political process, which we see Republicans doing right now. We now have 3 or 4 states that have passed laws that say that whoever wins the election is no longer up to the voters and up to the professional bean counters who keep track of the elections, but it's now up to the Republicans in their legislatures. So, you know, that's what we have, this corruption of the political process. I'll continue this rant right after the break. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Stick around. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Hey, we have a couple of special things over at ThomHartmann.com and HartmannReport.com. Of course, at HartmannReport.com, every single day, well, 6 days a week, Sunday accepted, I write a rant about an issue of the day that I think is important. Louise and I work on these together. We get them out typically around 6 in the morning Pacific time. And you'll find that at HartmannReport.com. It's free. You can sign up for it. There's no ads, whatever. But also over at ThomHartmann.com, we have a video every week for the supporters of our program. And the one this week is about how Wisconsin is trying to remove, in fact, they just got permission from their Supreme Court to remove 188,000 people from the voting rolls because they haven't voted in 4 years. This highlights the importance of getting to know who is your state representative, who is your state senator, and communicating with them regularly. It's all over at HartmannReport.com and ThomHartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So as I was saying, and just to highlight this transition, there is a transitional process that governments go through from being functioning democracies to being essentially fascist oligarchies. And in the middle of that process is the rise of a pseudo-nationalism, a new authoritarianism. One of the hallmarks of, and we're seeing this probably, I mean, we're seeing it played out in the United States right now, hugely, I mean, in real time. We have already seen it play out in countries like Hungary and Russia and the Philippines and Brazil. They're a little farther along than we are in most cases. Other countries, well, for example, in France right now, you're seeing the rise of Marine Le Pen, who is basically, France's Donald Trump, and there's a very good chance she's going to win the next election. And then France goes down, right? And to a large extent, this is this is always driven, at least according to Robert Michaels back in 1911, and I've seen nothing to contradict that over all these years. I read about this in The Hidden History of American Oligarchy at some length, that this corruption of the political process, deciding which votes get counted and which don't, so that the whole voting process becomes a charade. We now have 4 states that have instituted this, made it law, where the Republican legislatures get to decide which votes will be counted and which votes will be ignored. This false nationalism that celebrates a mythical past and papers over the past failings of the country, which is another way of preventing future, positive movement of the country. That is a key to it. We're seeing that right now in the cancel culture happening over on the Republican Party, canceling Liz Cheney, rewriting what happened on January 6th. We've had now a number of Republican members of Congress going, oh, it was just a normal day. You would have just thought it was tourists visiting the Capitol. Right. Civilian paramilitaries who terrorize the populace, which are, obviously we're seeing here, but also terrorize the political class. I think one of the most alarming pieces of news that I saw this week was Liz Cheney on TV saying that she knew that, or perhaps it was in an interview with the Washington Post. In any case, you can find a link to it in my op-ed here over at HartmannReport.com. That she knew that there were Republicans in Congress who were going to who wanted to vote to impeach Donald Trump the second time around, when it was just completely obvious what he had done and how impeachable it was, who did not vote to impeach him because they, quote, feared for their lives. That's Hitler's brown shirts. That's just short of the Night of the Long Knives, which was when the Nazis started actually assassinating their political opponents. The seizure of the courts so that you could selectively enforce the laws, another dimension of this, a huge and growing gap between the rich and the poor that's actually encouraged and maintained by the government, by government policy. Now, this is all kind of the bad news, everything that I've laid out for you. The good news is that the Biden administration, and again, frankly, I'm shocked by this, because I just, during the primaries, I was not a fan of Joe Biden. I wanted Bernie or Elizabeth Warren. But he has risen to the cause. Nobody thought Lyndon Johnson would become who Lyndon Johnson was. Very few people thought that Franklin Roosevelt would become who he became. And now Joe Biden is doing it. He is showing people that a small d democratic government, and a big D democratic government for that matter, can work. See, the first step in moving a country from democracy to fascistic oligarchy, the first step is causing the people to no longer trust their government, to believe that their government can't function, can't do things. And that first step was taken by Ronald Reagan in his inaugural address, January 20th, 1981, when he said, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the cause of our problems. That's the first step toward fascism. And the Republican Party has been pushing this as hard as they possibly can. If Biden can get through his American Jobs Plan and his American Families Plan, and if he can push these through via reconciliation, there's a good chance he'll do it, then maybe we can slow down the Republican rush to fascism. And obviously, if we can pass the For the People Act, H.R. 1, which is going to require blowing up the filibuster, then we can stop fascism dead in its tracks, or at least 3/4 of it. The stakes have never been higher. So coming up next, Congresswoman Representative Pramila Jayapal, for the next hour, will be taking your calls on the issues of the day. Stick around. We'll be back. It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, live from our studio.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I can't get over it. We're back in our studio. It's incredible. Back with Pramila Jayapal in just a moment. Today's book in our book club is The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by this guy, Thom Hartmann. This is from Chapter 1, or from the introduction, actually. In 2016, 6% of Americans who were eligible to vote nominated Donald Trump as the GOP's presidential candidate. It was 8% for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. Trump went on to be elected president by 26% of eligible voters. The modern American oligarchs have largely stayed in power using three simple elements: explicit and overt racism, massive disinformation campaigns, and voter suppression. No ideas, no push for better schools, hospitals, airports, roads, or bridges, or reform of our health, energy, or financial systems. No promise of more and better jobs. None of these staples of past presidential campaigns can be found in pretty much any Republican advertising today. Instead, the public Republican message is all about race, or the subset of race, religion. Muslim stands in for brown Arab in GOP speak, and immigration, aka brown people from south of our border, and socialism. Meanwhile, Republican secretaries of state across the nation are vigorously purging voters from the rolls. Over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, in just the 2016-2018 period, according to NBC News. After the, after the 5 Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 14 GOP-controlled states moved within a year, some within days, to restrict access to the vote, particularly for communities of color, students, and retired people. In North Carolina, for example, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the most African-American voters just before the 2016 election, leading to a 16% decline in African-American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide, Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line than white voters, and black voters can expect to wait 200% longer in line to vote. In Indiana, then-Governor Mike Pence's new rigorous voter ID law caused an 11.5% drop in African-American voting. Students are suing for their right to vote, and retired people who no longer drive but care passionately about their Social Security and Medicare are being turned away at the polls by the hundreds of thousands because their driver's licenses have expired. The obvious failure of 40-plus years of Reaganomics and GOP policies to maintain a functional middle class in America has been a problem for the modern GOP. In 1974, for example, the GOP had outright control of only 7 states. The message, elect us and we'll help the rich people, just didn't generally resonate with American voters. It's the reason why, outside of the fluke elections of 46 and 52, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives outright for 3 generations, from 1933 to 1996, and controlled the Senate for most of that time. Desperate to win the presidency for the GOP in 1968, Richard Nixon went so far as to commit treason by torpedoing a peace deal with President Lyndon Johnson that President Lyndon Johnson had worked out with the North and South Vietnamese. According to Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, then president of Iran, Ronald Reagan did the same thing by cutting a deal with Iran whereby they would hold on to the U.S. embassy hostages until after the 1980 presidential election, torpedoing Jimmy Carter's chances of re-election. But in 2000, the GOP changed tactics. After Reagan was almost busted for his part in Iran-Contra, he testified that he had forgotten about details of the program more than 80 times. His growing Alzheimer's spared him an indictment. They realized that getting busted for treason wasn't worth the risk. They needed a plan B, and it was deliciously simple. If most voters don't like what you're selling, then just don't let them vote. Paul Weyrich promoted this idea back in 1980 when he was campaigning for Reagan after co-founding the Heritage Foundation. And indeed, many Republican luminaries, such as William Rehnquist, who went from serving the GOP by standing in polling places and intimidating Hispanic and Native American voters in the 1960s, to becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rose up through the ranks by participating in Republican-run voter intimidation schemes. Voter suppression became the foundational go-to tactic for the GOP in 2000. Although the GOP attacked Democratic presidential nominee Al Gore with smear and innuendo, ridiculing him for helping write the legislation that created the modern internet, for example, the main thing that got George W. Bush into the White House was voter suppression. His brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, threw somewhere between 20,000 and 90,000 African-American voters off the rolls. They were able to get the vote close enough that 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court functionally awarded Bush the presidency. The BBC covered this in 2001 in 2 major investigative reports that were seen all over the world except on any American media. By 2016, the Republican Party had fine-tuned its voter suppression and intimidation systems to the point that they ran like well-oiled machines in nearly 30 states. Between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, for example, Ohio had purged more than 2 million voters from its rolls, the vast majority, more than 2 to 1, in heavily African-American and Hispanic counties. The 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that they could keep it up. And other states have since adopted their new tactic of caging voters. The book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, by me. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. In addition to the free newsletter that we have over at ThomHartmann.com, which gives you literally a link to every story or article I've talked about throughout the day, every day, comes into your email box every day. There's no charge. In addition to that, and my daily rants, which are free of advertising and free of charge over at HartmannReport.com, we also produce a weekly video. This week's video is about how power companies around the country, for-profit power companies 100% of the time, these power companies around the country are making it harder and harder and more expensive for people to install solar in their homes. All kinds of ways of trying to block people from doing this. And increasingly, they're getting support from Republican politicians, both at the local and the state level. It's something that we really need to know about, we need to be paying attention to, and we need to be aggressively pushing back on. You can check it out over at ThomHartmann.com and at HartmannReport.com. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Representative Jayapal represents the 7th District of Washington, the state of Washington, in the U.S. House of Representatives, as well as chairing the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Her website, Jayapal, Jayapal.gov, and her Twitter handle is Rep Jayapal, Jayapal, and she'll be taking your calls for the hour here at 202-808-9925. Representative Jayapal, first of all, welcome back. It's been a while since you've been on the show. It's great to have you back with us. And I'm wondering, before we pick up phone calls here over the course of the next hour, what's at the top of your mind? What are the things that you think that we really need to be paying attention to in our political world right now? And anything that you wanted to just kick the hour off with?
Absolutely, Tom. It is so great to be back with you. I always love being on your show. There are so many things, but let me just try to narrow in on a few. First of all, we are working very, very hard on a big, bold, and urgent plan for additional support to Americans across the country, a once-in-a-generation investment in the American Jobs and Families Plan. The Progressive Caucus has been prioritizing a number of pieces within that. First of all, bold action on climate change. We really believe that the total dollar amount should be higher than what the president has proposed. We also want to make sure that we're getting the clean energy standard across the line and making sure that we're investing of the dollars we spend, 40% going into frontline and affected communities. We also are pushing very, very hard, along with Senator Bernie Sanders and a number of other senators, to include lowering the cost of pharmaceutical drugs for Americans so that no American is paying more than in any other country, and then using the hundreds of billions of dollars of savings from that to lower the Medicare eligibility age and to expand Medicare benefits to include dental, vision, and hearing.
Wow.
And I hope we talk some more about that. That is a huge priority, and we are really leading the charge on pushing that. And then also on child care, a lot of what the jobs numbers have shown us is that women have been chased out of the job market, and they can't come back unless we start helping with child care. And so this opportunity to really have a bold child care program, even bolder than the one the president has proposed. I mean, I'm on board with the Warren proposal for no one pays more than 7% of their income. And that means no work requirements for child care, which unfortunately are contained right now in the bill, and also making sure we get rid of or expand the top threshold for who qualifies so that we're covering middle-class families in high cost of living areas. So there are a number of other things, but that's a big priority. Second, we're really focused, obviously, on continuing our fight around ending the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And unfortunately, we haven't been making as much progress there as we would like, but we're pushing very hard around that. And, of course, focused a lot of attention right now on the Middle East and making sure that we are addressing human rights there and calling for an immediate ceasefire and a much stronger position than what the Biden administration has taken. And the good news there is that I feel like finally, even in Congress, there's more support for focusing on Israel's violation of human rights and the annexation that's been happening over years that is preventing any movement forward in the Middle East. So it's a complex situation, but we're tracking that very closely. Third, global vaccine equity is something we spent a lot of time on. We were successful in getting the TRIPS waiver, the Biden administration to commit to the TRIPS waiver, which essentially allows for the WTO to, well, if it all goes through, there's still advocacy that needs to be done, but the United States has changed its position so that we need to allow these patents on these vaccines to be shared with other countries. And we're also pushing for more U.S. stock of vaccines to be sent. And in fact, if it hasn't happened, it's about to happen in a few minutes. The Biden administration will announce another 20 million doses of vaccines that will be sent. I'm pushing for 25 billion to be put into domestic manufacturing so that we can get more vaccines out to the rest of the world. So there's so many other things, but those are just three that are on our agenda right now.
What a list. You guys are doing such great work and so much of it, and I'm so impressed, and I'm so glad that you're there, and I can't tell you. So let's pick up some of our phone calls here. Rachel in Needham, Massachusetts, you are on the air with Representative Jayapal.
Hi, my name's Rachel, and I'd like to ask you, Congresswoman Jayapal, how do we get the $15 an hour package back on the table, since it seems like the White House does not want to push that agenda?
Yeah, Rachel, it's so important, and that is very much a part of our agenda as well. As you know, it was the Progressive Caucus that ensured that a $15 minimum wage was in the House version of the rescue package, but when it went to the Senate stripped it out, and the White House did not help us to ensure that we could overrule the parliamentarian, which I believe would have been a legitimate thing to do. But we could not get there. And so now there are really three ways that we can address this. One is to overrule the parliamentarian. We've seen that the White House isn't with us on doing that. The second is to eliminate the filibuster. This is another priority of the Progressive Caucus. In fact, we had a big week of action around this a couple of weeks ago, where over almost 24 of our members did individual events in their districts to educate people about the racist legacy of the filibuster and why we must eliminate it if we are to pass any of the major pieces of legislation that we have before us. The third is to attach the $15 minimum wage to a must-pass appropriations bill like the National Defense Authorization Act or some other such bill. We are looking at every opportunity that we have, and we're really trying to push the White House to say, look, you promised this, and you have to help us to get there. And that involves, also getting all 50 senators, Democratic senators, on board. As you know, we have some issues with a couple of them, but we're working very closely with our champions in the Senate, including Senator Sanders, and really saying this is something that you cannot go back to voters and say, hey, I'm sorry, we had to follow some arcane racist procedure that we could have changed as Democrats, called the filibuster, and so we couldn't get this through. So it's been very frustrating to us that there hasn't been more movement, but I do want people to know that there isn't a day or a week that goes by without us continuing to try to build the chorus across the country. That's one of the most important things, is particularly in states like Arizona and West Virginia, to continue the pressure to get a solution on 15.
Pat in Seattle, in Representative Jayapal's district. You are on the air with your representative. We have about 2 minutes to a hard break.
Okay, I'll go fast. Thank you so much. I'm so proud to have you as my Congresswoman. And my question is, if H.R. 1 gets through Congress, won't it eventually move up to the Supreme Court? And with 6 conservative judges on the Supreme Court who will most likely vote against it, what are the options after that? Or am I wrong about that scenario? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Pat, I'm so proud to be your representative, so thank you for that. So our focus right now is on getting S1, which is the H.R. 1 equivalent in the Senate, through, because we do think we have a good shot of, sustaining any challenge that might be made in the courts. But most importantly, we have to be able to pass this immediately to be able to stop some of the things that are happening in these states across the country. A Supreme Court challenge would take some time. We're not naive to what that threat is, but we believe we've done a lot of work on these provisions to make sure that they would sustain a challenge, be able to sustain a challenge. And so now, again, it comes back down to the filibuster. We passed it in the House, and it is absolutely essential that we pass it in the Senate, because you see all of the ways in which the Republicans know that they can't win on a Trump agenda of stripping basically stripping health care from people and sending tax cuts to the wealthiest. That's not going to do it. So the only other way they have to win is to suppress the vote in all these states. And that is a coordinated effort, as we found out by the Heritage Foundation, that we need to beat back immediately.
Representative Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus representing the 7th District of Washington, is with us until for the hour, until a half hour past the next hour. Jayapal, Jayapal.house.gov, the website. Rep Jayapal is her Twitter handle. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
More of your calls for the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus right after this. And welcome back. Let's see here. George in Seattle again. George, you're on the air with Representative Jayapal. You're drawing them out of the woodwork, Representative Jayapal.
That's great. I love it.
Yep. George, you're on the air.
Thanks for taking the call. In support of the proposal, Biden's proposals, and what the representative just listed, I'm wondering how we can encourage Biden to use his platform either through speeches or something similar, maybe to the fireside chats, to educate the population about the tax history of the United States, the theft of the commons, and the growth economics of recirculating dollars within the U.S. instead of funneling dollars to the uber rich and the international corporations. It's not minorities that are victimizing these racist whites. It's the uber rich and the powerful.
Yeah. Thank you for that, George. I think, one of the things that gives me the most hope about, and we progressives should really claim victory here, is the complete flip from the White House, even from previous Democratic administrations, about things like trickle-down economics, which we all knew never worked, and even the framing of these tax raisers, revenue raisers, that the White House has put forward in the plan and are really sticking to. They told me in one of my first meetings with the White House, this isn't about paying for infrastructure, because we know infrastructure pays for itself. Raising, the taxes on those earning over $400,000 and on corporations, and stopping corporations from hiding their money in other countries, is something that is about making the tax system fair and addressing all of the deep inequities within our system and the robbing of frankly, investments in the people by the uber wealthy. And so that is really important. And I think your idea of fireside chats is a really interesting one. The president has been talking about these tax increases on the rich and the big corporations quite a bit. And the White House is, we're going to lean into this from the Progressive Caucus. And so I'll take back the idea of kind of doing a set of chats with the public and having members really engage on that, because I think it's important.
We just have half a minute here to the break. I wonder if that's the sort of thing, if Vice President Harris were to do, might raise her profile a little bit. On the other hand, it would probably make the right wing go nuts.
Yes, I'm sure it would.
But should we worry about that? I don't think so. I don't know. Your thoughts?
All of us should do it, and
Yeah.
I know you do it all the time, Tom, so I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think the idea of Franklin Roosevelt was so effective at doing that. None of us are old enough to actually remember that, but history tells us that. And Lyndon Johnson, I was just listening to a speech that LBJ gave in support of Medicare. And, he was it was like a fireside chat. I mean, he was just like, talking to people about this. It was quite remarkable. Okay, we'll be back in just 1 minute. I have to read an advertisement over on the commercial side, and we will be back in 60 seconds with more of Representative Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, taking your calls in just a moment. We'll be right back. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Gretchen Reynolds over at the New York Times has been compiling for the last year or so, maybe a little longer, but I've been noticing it for the last year, some just remarkable statistics and information coming out of peer-reviewed scientific journals about the benefits of very, very small, short amounts of exercise on the quality of life and the lifespan, the ability to survive disease of all of us. Frankly, some of the studies were on younger people. A lot of the studies were on people over 50. And I'm talking very small amounts of exercise, like literally 4 minutes of bicycling, or 4 seconds, of bicycling really hard on a stationary bicycle, followed by 56 seconds of just relaxing. And doing that 15 times, over a 15-minute period, a couple of times a week. 4 seconds of exercise produce measurable results. It's all over at ThomHartmann.com. We got a new video up for the people who are supporters of our program. You can check it out. And welcome back. Representative Pramila Jayapal taking your calls for the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. And Charles in Miami, Florida. Charles, you are on the air with Representative Jayapal.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
Hey, Charles.
Hello. Since Ronald Reagan repealed the New Deal on his own through his administration, and he's got people convinced that, well, I'm convinced right now that government never works when Republicans run it. It seems like they cheated. They stole the election in 2016. They used everything in their power. And, you could just look at how they treat Americans as far as they're so corrupt. They purge legitimate voters. They rig voter machines. They have fake polls, fake punditry so they can call so-called close races. This country was not, in my opinion, falling into authoritarian. I think what they did was...
Charles, forgive the interruption, but what's your question for Representative Jayapal?
I'm sorry. So how are we going to expose this? Because this shouldn't happen again, and it's very easy. I can see why the Republicans are fighting tooth and nail not to have this commission, because a lot of people can go to jail on their side.
So, okay. How do we investigate the last 2 elections, in other words?
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. No,
Thank you, Charles.
I think this is something. Thank you, Charles. I mean, I think this is a really important point. I was on TV on MSNBC yesterday with Jonathan Capehart saying, I think the biggest threat to our national security at this moment is the fact that we have a Republican Party that refuses to do anything other than pledge fealty to the one-man cult of Donald Trump. And that involves lying about the election and doing everything they can to cheat the people of a real democracy. I mean, I agree with you, Charles, and that is why we're fighting so hard for the commission. It's why it was so important that we got a new Justice Department in that has already filed charges against hundreds of people that were part of the insurrection. It's why the investigations that, we were involved in the Judiciary Committee under Democrats in the House are not over yet. I mean, Chris McGahn, as you might have seen, there was a ruling around Chris McGahn testifying before us. He will come and be interviewed. We are still looking into all of the things that happened in 2016. But you're right, there isn't the accountability yet. We're working to get that, and it was why it was so important that people came out and voted to give us a Democratic White House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House.
Marie in New York City, you are on the air with Representative Jayapal, and we're about 2.5 minutes out from the break. Marie?
I just saw someone, that's right.
Oh, Marie is listening to her.
Hello?
Okay,
yes,
there you go, Marie.
Marie here.
Yeah,
Listen,
you are on the air.
Get down to the real nitty-gritty. If they don't fix the post office, if Biden doesn't do something about this postal, Mr. DeJoy and the rest of that crew are accepting for the people he put on, if your people can't put their their ballots in the mail, then the ballots won't get to where they're supposed to go. Not that it's going to do any good with these crazy people taking them and stealing them and counting them again and shining lights, et cetera, but basics. Get the post office back together and find out some kind of way that they can get those machines back or get new ones built, and all the things that have been talked about for the post office.
Got it, Marie. Let's let Representative Jayapal answer your comment.
Yeah, I hear you, Marie. And in fact, you might have seen that the Biden administration just appointed nominated a new person to the Postal Board, which has the authority to get rid of, to really get rid of the current leadership and make a change in the Postal Service. And of course, we're doing a lot of accountability hearings and putting money into the Postal Service. We did some of that in the past bill, but we just have to do more. So you're absolutely right that that's been a top priority. And Louis DeJoy, all of the information is coming out about how corrupt he was and how he got that position in the first place. But we need to roll all of that back, and we're in the process of doing that, thankfully, now, and we will soon have a majority on that board.
Representative, we just have a minute to the break here at the top of the hour. So if I may ask just a very quick question. He destroyed over 700 machines. These high-speed sorting machines could sort 40,000 pieces of mail a minute. And as I recall, maybe it was per hour, whatever it was massive. And they cost millions and millions of dollars, and some of them were custom made for the post office. Is anybody appropriating money to replace those machines? Because, the mail is a whole lot slower now than it was just a year ago before he destroyed those machines.
Yes, that will be a part of the appropriations budget. But also, interestingly, in some places like Seattle, those machines were taken out, but some of the Postal Service employees did not destroy them. So there's also, we're also looking to see what was destroyed and what is still there, but just was taken out of use. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a really good thing if we can put some of those things back into place and get our mail moving again. Okay, on the other side of this break here at the top of the hour, in about 6 minutes or so, we will be back for another half hour with Representative Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, representing the 7th District of Washington in the U.S. House of Representatives. Jayapal, Jayapal.gov, and on the internet and over on Twitter, Rep Jayapal. We'll be right back. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More information at hellofresh.com, code TOM. CB Distillery for sleeping and pain relief. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. Annie's Kit Clubs, creativity delivered right to your door. More info is available at annieskitclubs.com/Tom. Easy Flow, personal air filtration system. Fresh air anywhere. More info at easyflowusa.com, code TOM. Masterclass with world-class instructors. More info at masterclass.com/Hartmann. And Dinovite, only the best all-natural pet supplements. More info at dinovite.com.
We say fight back!
We're in this camera, right? 3. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Minority Leader, How to Lead from the Outside and Make Real Change by Stacey Abrams. This is from chapter 1, although the introduction is fascinating too, where she talks about, Rhodes scholarships and stuff, but this is chapter 1. I sit in the living room, a cozy space, warm in the early summer. I'm perched on the edge of a sofa next to Valerie, the home's owner, a lovely black woman in her late 40s. Across from us, seated close together on a wide settee met for one, are her 2 children, a son and a daughter. Politicians rarely visit their streets, which are nestled in a poorer community in South Georgia. Valerie beams with pride that both her children are headed to college in the fall. David, 17, plans to study criminology. Maya, 18, her belly round with her first child, intends to become a middle school teacher. Both newly graduated from high school, Maya will give birth in mere weeks and begin college months later, an unwed teen mother. Her intended school is more than 3 hours north of her home, so her mother will raise her newborn baby while she starts her freshman year. Valerie speaks matter-of-factly about the coming challenge, raising a new child just as hers leaves the nest. Still, she is determined that both her children pursue college degrees that she never received. Maya, the mother-to-be, wonders how she'll do so far away from home and her baby. Yet in the next breath, she explains how college will be the best for her and her child. Their future success rests upon her. I've come to their home as part of my campaign for governor, so I asked Valerie what she expects of someone like me. What can I do to help make lives like hers better? In her soft voice, she replies, she just wants options for financial aid for her children. They will succeed, she says, if they can afford to stay in school. As I look around the modest home passed down through the generations, I understand both the pride and the desperation tangled in her response. She got them through and has given them the tools to carve out better lives for themselves. We chat more about the worries she's lived with all those years, our discussion turning to the crime and poverty in their neighborhood. Then I ask Valerie what she wants. At first, all I get in response is a quizzical look to suggest I need to reconsider my bid for higher office. Or that suggests. I repeat, what do you want for you? What secret dream do you have for yourself? Her confused expression turns to one of surprise. I don't know, she tells me. I've been a cashier at the Piggly Wiggly for 20 years. You must want something, I probe, something you'd like to do for you? A daycare, she admits quietly. I'd like to start a daycare center for unwed mothers like my daughter, so more girls can finish school and pursue their dreams. But that ambition is beyond her. Her body language, her tone of voice, her averted gaze speak louder than her words. I press her, but she demurs with a smile. Let's just see what happens if you win the governor's job, she says. Valerie's house in South Georgia is not too different from the squat red brick house where I grew up on South Street in Gulfport, Mississippi. An oak tree grew out in our front yard, shadowing the front sidewalk, forbidding grass to grow beneath its shade. Pink azaleas bloomed each spring from bushes that flanked the front door. Our rented house and the other set close by teemed with children, all black, all working class. We played in our postage-stamped yards, make believing the fantastical, superhero exploits, cops and robbers. As we got older, we'd talk about moving to New Orleans or living in one of the mansions along the beachfront that lay less than 5 miles away, across the railroad tracks that ran in between our neighborhood and the more wealthy environs. We dreamed of more, while our parents' lives centered around survival and making it from paycheck to paycheck. Instinctively, we understood that more had to be possible, even if we didn't know what to do to get there. These imaginings, these desires, are the roots of ambition. As adults, like Valerie, we tend to edit our desires until they fit our construction of who we're supposed to become. In such a world, I wouldn't dare dream of running for higher office, for mayor or governor or president. At least for now, Valerie sees herself retiring in 20 more years from Piggly Wiggly as a cashier, rather than as a small business owner who helps the community raise its children. From our brief meeting, I could see she had the fire, albeit of a low burn, of a minority leader. She had ambition, she had vision, but she didn't have the faith, and understandably so. Whether we come from working class neighborhoods or grow up comfortably middle class, minorities rarely come of age explicitly thinking about what we want and how to get it. People already in power almost never have to think about whether they belong in the room, much less if they would be listened to once outside. These men, and they are usually men and typically white, do not have to grapple with low expectations based on gender or race or class. Ambition for them begins with reminiscences of old times and older friendships or newer alliances. The ends have already been decided. Only the means are to be discussed. Most potential minority leaders feel the same lack of faith Valerie had, at least at some point in their evolution. We may not know how to get the first job, let alone make it to the big chair. We don't know how to take the leap from accepting our fates to actually changing them, and not just a little, but radically. Then there are those who simply don't know what they want. The drive to achieve burns inside, often without a clear target. We want to be something, but what that is remains hazy. Often we cannot articulate our goals because they lie just beyond the reach of who we're supposed to be. Ambition's scale is irrelevant. What holds us back is not scope, it's fear. And because we don't know what to call our dreams, don't know how to make them happen, or are pretty sure we'll be disappointed, we just stand still. But becoming a minority leader demands that we embrace ambition as our due. Stacey Abram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Representative Pramila Jayapal is on the line with us, taking your calls for the hour, or for the next half hour, as it were. And Representative Jayapal, you're still with us, right?
I sure am.
Okay, great. Okay, let's pick up some phone calls here. Bill in Los Angeles, you are on the air with Representative Jayapal.
Hello, Representative Jayapal. My name is Bill. I'm a union member from Los Angeles. And we've been discussing in our union halls the merits, the pluses and minuses of the PRO Act. It seems to us that the radicals and militants within the union movement, that the Democrats party would have us believe that more government intervention into the process of unionization would benefit the union members. But I think the way we understand it, militants in the union, that rights for the workers are not handed down from the high halls of Congress, but are won through struggle. So why should we accept government arbitration with your Neo-Wagner Act that reinforces things like the Taft-Hartley agreement?
Huh. That's such a weird question, framing Representative Jayapal, because before the Wagner Act, companies routinely murdered people who went on strike. But your thoughts?
Well, I'm with you. I'm sort of scratching my head around that frame, because what we know is that, employers have done everything possible to prevent unionization. Why? Because when you don't have democracy in the workplace, you don't have collective bargaining, what you have is complete power over all those people that work at the company. And so that is, all of the efforts that we've had around ensuring that the government is protecting the power dynamic between workers who are organizing and the employers, the boss, is absolutely essential. Without that, and that's what we see over the last several decades, as these big corporations and deregulation has gotten government out of really ensuring that workers have the right to collectively bargain on the job. Now what you see is all of the effects of that. You see lower wages, you see no benefits, you see workplace rights being violated with no accountability. And of course, the most recent example of this is the way in which Amazon did everything that they could to prevent workers and to mar the process of unionizing in Bessemer. And so I don't totally understand that framing, because for me, what we need to do is ensure that government is actually strengthening workplace democracy, strengthening the ability for workers to organize on the job, and stop basically make it much, much harder, which is what the PRO Act would do, to pressure workers against forming a union. Because right now, employers can, they can force employees to sit more or less all day long in captive audience meetings. They can, force anti-union consultants or managers or supervisors from telling you that this is going to be a bad decision if you join the union. If you vote to join the union, they can delay elections. They can do all kinds of things because we don't have the regulation that we need from the federal level. So I'm happy to go on and on about the PRO Act. Yeah. I'm a lead sponsor of it. And, I believe that it is a first step, not a last step, Tom, but a first step for some of what we need to do. Yeah. I'm also interested in looking at sectoral bargaining more broadly and other tools that get at the current way in which the economy is structured with gig workers and others. But the PRO Act is a meaningful and important step forward. Yeah, that framing was almost word for word out of, Coke Industry. Well, not out of Club for Growth and Freedom Works, the Koch brothers organizations. Norm in Tampa, Florida, you are on the air with Representative Jayapal.
Good afternoon, Tom. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for this forum that you provide to directly talk with Congress. And no one else does that on radio, so thank you so much. Representative Jayapal, I want to know when Congress is going to address the war on drugs. And when we talk about the war on drugs is based upon foundation of structural racism and systemic racism, and was implemented to destroy people of color in America by Richard Nixon. And Congress, 30 years ago, my good friend John Conyers had a committee, put a panel together on a committee of oversight and investigation that dealt with this issue, and I was on the panel, all right? And so I looked at a videotape on C-SPAN, and you can see this because it was chaired by Ron Daniels, and the issues that they talked about then have changed not at all from what they're talking about now. And now this war on drugs is now targeting healthcare providers, and guess who? Minority people of color who are healthcare providers, from blacks, Nigerians, Indians, people from Asia, people from China, those sort of things. And this is what we want. When is Congress going to deal with this? And this Justice Department that has systematically used this war to undermine people of color and this racist policy that continues 40 years after the fact. And 40 years. When is Congress going to do something, please? Yeah.
Yeah. So incredibly important of a question. To your point, I mean, the war on drugs was really the extension of the Jim Crow legacy, right? I mean, it's a seamless transition, and there are 1.35 million arrests per year for drug possession, 500,000 arrests for marijuana alone. but less than 500,000 arrests per year for violent crimes. And your point about the structural racism that exists within the system is the most important point. A black person is almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person, even though blacks and whites use marijuana at the similar rate. So I think the work that we have to do is extensive. We started some of that with the Second Choice Act that we passed. I got the title wrong, but I'm just going blank on the exact term of it, which would allow for a number of people to be released from prison for drug possession. There is a much bigger bill called the MORE Act, which is around marijuana, cannabis legalization, that is also, I think, rooted in exactly some of the things that you're talking about. And there are efforts that are happening at the state level, which I think is really important, both Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Montana, South Dakota. I mean, states across the country where Americans are turning out to say that it's time to stop criminalizing drug use. So we have a lot of work to do on this, but I agree with you. And I think one thing, Tom, one thing that the movement for Black Lives has really helped bring to the forefront is the structural racism that exists within almost every single arena, and the way in which the tools of enforcement and criminalization have been used against black people, brown people, indigenous people, and poor people too in this country. And I think the war on drugs is one example of that. And then caller is exactly right. It's inextricable from the struggle for racial justice.
Yeah, and H.R. Haldeman was tracked down by a reporter maybe 15, 20 years ago before he died, and asked about this. And he said, yeah, we heavily criminalized these drugs because we could use them to break up the anti-war hippies in the black community, and we could use this rubric to infiltrate their communities and destroy them. And he said, did we know it was a lie? Yes, of course we knew it was a lie. That's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Representative Jayapal represents the 7th District of Washington in the U.S. House, but perhaps more importantly is the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Listeners up in the Seattle area who are very happy that she represents their area. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Jonathan in Portland, Oregon. You're on the air with Representative Jayapal.
Hi, Representative Jayapal. I'm calling about the destruction of the AP building in Gaza, and which is nothing less than an act of war against the United States. And I'm saying that because there's nothing more American than the Associated Press. It's been counting our votes since 1848, the preeminent news organization in the world. And not one member of Congress, including you, Chairperson, have said nothing about this blatant attack against the United States. And while the United States watched and effectively allowed this to happen. And I'd like to hear your answer.
Yeah, thank you. It is I think this has been an extremely difficult time, and the Progressive Caucus, members of the Progressive Caucus have led the efforts in Congress, including Mark Pocan, my former co-chair, who I know is on this show a lot, Jan Schakowsky, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. We gave our Progressive Caucus special order hour actually last week to what's happening in Israel and Gaza. We have, I think, more support than ever before to actually consider withholding aid from Israel because we cannot be having U.S. tax dollars go to supporting human rights abuses. And that's something that I've been pushing for years, actually, but I think it finally feels like it's something that even more mainstream Democrats are starting to look at. So I don't know whether specifically people address the issue of the AP building in Gaza, but I know I've seen the statement from the Journalists Association that this was a direct attack on AP because Israel didn't want AP to cover what was happening in Gaza, and I believe that to be true, and I think it is absolutely outrageous. I think the big question here is, when is the United States going to stop continuing to supply military equipment, aid to Israel and allow Israel to utilize that aid and those American taxpayer dollars to continue its human rights abuses. I was in, I think it was 4 years ago or 3 years ago, I was in the Middle East and Israel. We tried to go into Gaza. It was actually when there was rocket fire back and forth, and so we couldn't get into Gaza proper. But I was there at Khan al-Ahmar when the bulldozers showed up. They didn't actually bulldoze the village that day because there was an injunction, and the Supreme Court stopped the bulldozing that day. But we were there. The bulldozer was there. And, seeing the way in which Israel has brazenly continued its annexation of these villages and essentially putting any end to the idea of a two-state democracy, a two-state solution. This has been a tinderbox in the making. Trump administration made it so much worse, but I have to say that I'm really disappointed in how the Biden administration is handling this right now.
It seems like the pressure is cranking up.
I think so.
Hopefully there'll be some resolution of this, because it's and the United States continuing to support Israel and what they're doing, and Saudi Arabia in bombing Yemen as well.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Congresswoman Representative Pramila Jayapal is with us, taking your calls for the hour. Back with more of your calls for Representative Jayapal in just a moment. Her website is Jayapal, JAYAPAL.house.gov, and you can tweet her at Rep Jayapal. We'll be right back. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So people wonder, why militias all of a sudden? How is it that all kinds of Americans are showing up with assault weapons in the Capitol building, trying to assassinate the Vice President of the United States and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and stop the counting of the presidential votes, the Electoral College votes? Where did this come from? The last time we saw an armed uprising against the federal government in the United States was 1861. It was the Confederacy. Is this a Confederacy rising again? Well, yeah, there is a huge white supremacist element to it. In fact, I'd say it's one of the primary animating impulses. But what really got these things going, these militias going, was the Heller decision written by the opinion written by Antonin Scalia and published on June 26, 2008. And it has crazy language in it, basically begging for militias. I share it with you in a special video over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. Back, Representative Pramila Jayapal taking your calls for the hour. Tyrone in Harlem, New York. You are on the air with Representative Jayapal.
Thank you for taking my call. I was wondering about the January 6th 9/11 commission. Will they have teeth to deal with whatever they find? Because if they find a smoking gun, will they be prepared to do what's necessary to deal with these lawless people that we know have no respect for the country and the laws of this country?
Yes, this is a really important issue that you're raising, and some of you know I was trapped in the gallery on January 6th, and I not only is it about fearing, dealing with the personal trauma of that, but really seeing how close we were to losing our democracy, how fragile it is, and how it could happen again. And that doesn't stop unless we have this commission. So the bipartisan agreement, which still has to be voted on and get through the House and then through the Senate as well, does have subpoena power and accountability power built into it. My only I think it's an extremely important development. I'm not clear that Kevin McCarthy, the leader of the Republicans in the House, is even going to go along with it, though he seems to have given his tacit approval to John Katko, the Republican who negotiated this on the Republican side with us. So let's see. But I think, this is going to be important in terms of who's named to the commission. We have to make sure that the Republican members that are named are not taking this into all kinds of other crazy areas, but that it is focused on January 6th and that it is focused on bringing accountability and getting the information, which has slowly been coming out in different ways, but we need all of it and we need it quickly so that we can then respond with whatever changes need to be made so that it doesn't happen again. I am very afraid, Tom, that this is far from over with the Republican Party completely embracing Donald Trump and the big lie and, kicking a conservative member like Liz Cheney out of leadership because she wouldn't admit that Donald Trump was trying to steal an election and subverting our democracy.
Yeah, I think they're pushing us toward full-blown oligarchy, and it scares the hell out of me.
Yep.
Ed in Chicago, you are on the air with Representative Jayapal.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman, for doing this today. My question is, does the Progressive Caucus have a way of communicating on a regular basis with your Democratic colleagues in the Senate? And the reason I ask this, and I know this is anecdotal, but it seems whenever I talk to the staffers, when I call my senators, I'll ask them if they're familiar with Free Speech TV or Thom Hartmann or Randy Rhoads. And I would say 80 to 90% of the time, the answer is no.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, the answer to your question is absolutely. I am on the phone with Bernie Sanders, who, of course, was, I think many would feel like he got a lot of his big start with you, Tom, on the show. But I'm in conversation with him multiple times a week.
That's great.
And I also have made it a priority as chair this year to really reach out to all the other members of the Senate as well who are progressive. So I have regular conversations with Senator Warren, Senator Merkley. I've been developing relationships with Senator Padilla, now even with Senator Menendez on a few things. And so we are really working, Senator Markey, obviously, Senator Murphy on foreign policy issues. So we are really working to connect the House and the Senate efforts because nothing is going to be successful unless we do that now that we have control of the Senate. And I also do talk to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, on a pretty regular basis, because if we are going to be successful with our progressive agenda in the House, we need the Senate to back us on it, and we need to use all our leverage between the House and the Senate progressives, along with the outside groups and outside movement, to really get us there.
Tomas in Madison, Wisconsin, we have 1 minute and 15 seconds. A very quick question, please, for Representative Jayapal.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for taking my call. My question is, what can the U.S. government do to encourage large multinational corporations to stop environmentally devastating resource extraction from developing countries, given that many of these corporations are based in the United States?
Great.
Yeah, such an important question, Tomas. And in a minute, it's a hard question to answer, but what we're trying to do is everything from taking on trade agreements and what corporations actually have the ability to do, but also then addressing it with our climate change proposals here in the United States. We know that that's not going to completely ban, for example, fossil fuel extraction, but the more that we can push as the United States to move away from fossil fuels towards clean energy, hopefully that is a worldwide effort. And, of course, everything that we do with the United Nations and the Paris Accord, every, diplomatic effort that we can get involved in, we need to.
Representative Jayapal, thanks so much for dropping by today. It is so great having you with us and having you as chair of the Progressive Caucus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Always love being on your show.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Great talking with you. We'll be right back with more of the news of the day and your calls. And, actually, Dean Obeidallah is going to drop by. He's got family on the West Bank in Israel. We'll be back with that in just a minute.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Stick around for Dean Obeidallah, and then I'll pick up your phone calls after that. We'll be right back. Our book today is Can We All Be Feminists? It's a collection of essays edited by Jane Eric Udori. This first chapter, or first essay, is from Charlotte Shane. It's called No Wave Feminism. If you feel like feminism is failing you, you're not alone. I sometimes have the impression that I'm as thoroughly feminist as I am thoroughly human. That feminism is as intrinsic to my contribution to my constitution as my skeleton is to my body. But in my 35 years, I've struggled with or outright rejected feminism on several occasions. First, as an ignorant adolescent, what do women need feminism for if they already got the vote? Then, as a sex worker who saw how regularly and even gleefully feminists stoked the public's long-standing antipathy toward professionally sexual women. And now, again, as someone moving even further into the far left, who cannot abide the forms of feminism that embrace and are complicit with the worst aspects of liberalism. The more I learn about the intersecting oppressive forces that continue to shape the Western world, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, xenophobia, and racism, and the network of cruel social machinery to which these systems give rise, incarceration, crippling debt, disenfranchisement, deportation, and so on, the less sense it makes to use gender as the primary lens through which to regard human-engineered suffering. Feminism doesn't feel like the sharpest weapon to wield against white supremacy or border policing, for instance, or even the best tool with which to approach basic civic concerns like vibrant schools. That's not because those issues don't impact women. Obviously, they directly and indirectly impact many. But they don't necessarily impact women more or in dramatically different ways than they do men. In other words, the most significant challenges these issues present aren't tethered to one's sex. And so prioritizing gender above other aspects of identity limits one's realm of ethical responses. Here's an example. American prisons often keep female prisoners shackled while they give birth. There are variations on the theme. Some women are shackled during labor, some are unshackled, but then shackled again almost immediately afterward. And almost all are shackled while heavily pregnant. There's some variation of what shackling entails, too. It can mean being cuffed at the wrists or at the ankles, or both, or cuffed to a hospital bed or chained at the waist. Articulating these details makes the sadism even starker. A class-action federal lawsuit in 2017 alleged more than 40 women at the Milwaukee County Jail suffered this horror. It was preceded by lawsuits in 2014 and 2016 against that same jail for similar practice. But the appalling practice is hardly confined to one city or one state. In 2015, New York prisons were found to be shackling prisoners in labor in spite of a state law that made it illegal to do so. And according to a 2016 report by the Prison Birth Project and Prisoners' Legal Services of Massachusetts, jails and prisons in Massachusetts were guilty of similar violations. Most feminists probably agree that this is a feminist issue. The topic accordingly receives coverage on feminist websites and sometimes in women's magazines. But does a feminist obligation to attend to the rights of the imprisoned extend only as far as pregnancy and labor? Or is it a feminist issue when a non-pregnant woman is shackled? Or when she is caged for years and exploited for her labor, denied face-to-face visits from loved ones, held captive in a compound in the name of, quote, justice? If the answer to these questions is yes, then it is also a feminist issue. Then is it also a feminist issue when men are shackled during various health emergencies, seizures, say? In 2014, a male inmate in Colorado died after undergoing several seizures while in restraints and receiving no medical treatment. Is it a feminist issue when incarcerated men are denied the right to visit with family or exploited for their labor? Is it a feminist issue when so many men are raped while in prison? Or does feminism's responsibility begin and end with gender-based mistreatment? The feminists hired by prominent media outlets often advocate for measures that would result in higher levels of incarceration. They write op-eds in favor of further criminalization around sex work and call for longer prison sentences for men convicted of assault, which we've known for decades is not necessarily synonymous with men who committed the crime. They also disturbingly relish the theater of sentencing, like that enacted by Judge Rosemary Aquilina, who told serial sexual abuser Larry Nassar that if she could, she would allow some or many people to do to him what he did to others. So sexual violation is an atrocity unless it happens to the right person. They capitalize on women's justified fear and anger around mistreatment by men to shore up the status quo. to suggest that our current problems are not the result of fundamentally unjust institutions, but rather institutions that are only incidentally sexist. That means that those same institutions could become less so with the right adjustments, like more draconian sentencing for crimes against women or more female judges. But the prison system is racist and brutal by design, not by accident or mismanagement, just as the court system regularly fails the most vulnerable because it was built to protect the powerful. The challenge of the 21st century is not to demand equal opportunity to participate in the machinery of oppression, revolutionary thinker Angela Davis has written. Rather, it is to identify and dismantle those structures. Yet leveraging our existing legal system for criminalization remains the go-to strategy for most feminists when it comes to dealing with objectionable behavior. The book, Can We All Be Feminists? Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So back in the day, and I mean back in the 1780s, literally, when the Constitutional Convention was happening in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, there was this debate about the quality of the vote. Whether people who only landowners should be allowed to vote, stuff like that. And, in order to ensure that well-informed people who really care about voting are the only ones voting. It didn't pass. It was rejected by the framers of the Constitutional Convention, this idea that only landowners should be allowed to vote. Never made it in the Constitution. But a variation on this is now being proposed in the Arizona legislature. And State Representative John Kavanaugh, who's the chair of the committee that's pushing this legislation, says the quality of the vote is important. We have to look at the quality of votes as well. I've got a new video all about this for the supporters of our program over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. On the commercial side there, my apologies if you heard silence for a few minutes. First time back in the studio, went down the hall to, do what you do when you go down the hall, came back and forgot to plug my microphone back in. I'm just like, I'm not used to being in my own studio. But we're back, and on the line with us is my buddy, Dean Obeidallah, the host of the Dean Obeidallah Show, our buddy. He's weekdays, Sirius XM Progress channel, 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, as channel 127. He's also a columnist with the Daily Beast. And Dean of Radio is his website.com, deanofradio.com. And, of course, Dean Obeidallah, Obeidallah is his Twitter handle. Dean, welcome back to the program. I understand you have family on the West Bank in Israel. It's of course, Gaza that's under attack right now. But the West Bank has been under kind of slow, continuous attack for decades, it seems. Your thoughts on what's going on right now?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Tom. I appreciate it. I just wrote about it for CNN. What's going on now is heartbreaking. There's no winners in this battle between Hamas and Israel. There's just pain and suffering. Unequal, very much so, but still pain and suffering. I mean, you have, as of now, 10 Israelis have been killed, including a 5-year-old boy. On the Palestinian side, over 200 are dead now, including nearly 60 children and about 40 women who have been killed. So it's like a movie, it seems, for people, I'm sure, like Groundhog Day, like it keeps coming back. In reality, the last time you had a battle this fierce was 7 years ago. But what happens in between these battles that get the headlines are the continuation of the Israeli occupation of, for example, my family in the West Bank, which they've limited freedom of movement. The checkpoints can be open or closed. If you're a Palestinian living in East Jerusalem, that you can be evicted from your home, which they're trying to do right now in this area called Sheikh Jarrah, where they've lived there for generations, but Israeli settlers will go to the court and say, well, we have priority. We're Jewish. They're not. And we're citizens because we're Jewish. They're not citizens. They're Arab Christians or Muslims. And the courts side with them and take their land. And that sort of was a backdrop to this fight we're having now. It started from there, this immediate time. But people always go, oh, they've been fighting for thousands of years. Not in reality, no. The struggle began in 1948 with the creation of Israel, and then you had the Palestinians dispossessed from their land, and it's really continued from there till now. It's just taken on I think the difference is there are more Democrats who are outspoken about Palestinian humanity. And that's all I want as a Palestinian American, is people to recognize our humanity. And then from there, perhaps we can press our government to press the parties for really a just settlement that views the Palestinian Christians and Muslims as being worthy of humanity, which often on the right and even some on the left in the past, to be blunt, have not seen that about Palestinians. So that was the point of my article, and that's where I'm trying to get people to. It's not litigating what's going on between now Hamas and Israel. This, I hope, will end today, if it will not in the next day or two. But from there, this fades from the headlines, and America goes back to its business, and the world goes back to their business, and once again, the Palestinians are forgotten. But the Netanyahu administration does not forget what their goals are, which is expanding settlements and making a Palestinian state impossible.
Yeah. The Israeli argument, or the argument that's being made in Israel for evicting Palestinians from that part of East Jerusalem is that, well, that was 900 years ago. That was Jewish territory. I mean, both sides making these kind of weird claims, not weird claims, historic claims. You're much more of a scholar of this than I am, and I mean,
I've lived through it more than that.
Yeah,
my dad's
exactly.
Palestinian, I grew up listening to stories about it, and I've been there.
Yeah, and
I'm not just a scholar, but I've lived it.
Yeah. So, and I've been to Israel a number of times, but nothing at the level of understanding that you have. What would be your suggestion if you were, emperor of the world? How does this resolve itself? And particularly,
of the world,
I mean, both we got the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, there's
right.
two separate things here that I realize.
If I was
are
emperor of the
interrelated.
world, I would work on a lot of different things. In fact, having maybe a 4-hour-a-day radio show. But if I were to focus a little bit on the Middle East here, as emperor of the world, the solution now is it is difficult to see what a solution would look like now. I've been a long advocate of a two-state solution. The number of settlements built, hundreds of thousands in the West Bank, make a contiguous Palestinian state impossible there. Gaza and the West Bank don't connect. If people don't know this, they're not connected. There's been different ideas in the past. Maybe you connect it with something, a monorail system, something along those lines. But we're not even at that point. You've got Netanyahu who ran beginning in 2015 saying, although he was prime minister before that, beginning in 2015 and repeating it, saying there will not be a Palestinian state on my watch. He's prime minister. So discussing what the contours of a Palestinian state might be are meaningless because there's no partner for Palestine on the other side. You've got Netanyahu who only talks about annexing wide swaths of the West Bank. And one of the few things the Trump administration did in not giving carte blanche to Netanyahu was saying no to that because they understood how bad that would be, and that would make it impossible for even having the charade of talking about a two-state solution. It would end that once and for all. So to me, I don't want to see peace. I'm not sure if it's two states. I don't know if it's one state. I don't know if it's a federation, an EU setup type of thing. Whatever it would be, that would be lasting and a just peace that would respect the self-determination of the Palestinians and the self-determination and aspirations and security of Israelis. What I see so often in American politics, and Bernie Sanders changed it, was just people saying, what about the Israeli security and safety of their people, without adding, we should be concerned equally with the Palestinian safety and security. And that's the point of my article now. I mean, it's 2021. I mean, we're long past this. We must be talking about a real solution where you respect and recognize Palestinian self-determination for the Christians and Muslims who live there. My family's, if you're over 50, you're in the West Bank, you're born into an occupation run by the Israelis, you live your whole life. And if things don't change, you die under occupation, not knowing freedom, not having personal self-determination. Forget sovereign, personal self-determination, because you don't know when a checkpoint's going to be open and not, where you can go, and your freedom to travel is limited. And it affects your freedoms for jobs and health care. Everything's impacted there, and we just don't see the story of it here in America.
There is at least one political party in Israel that explicitly just basically wants to expel all non-Jews from Israel. Netanyahu has made alliance with this party and these politicians. To what extent do you think that First you had the Palestinian response to the appropriation of lands in the area around East Jerusalem, and then this just kind of metastasized all the way to Gaza, and now we've got this explosion going on in our face. I mean, I'm talking about just in the last few weeks. To what extent does it seem to you that this is Benjamin Netanyahu trying to stay out of prison and get another term as prime minister?
Well, there are certainly people who say that, including liberal Israelis and Arabs living in Israel, that they think this is somehow Netanyahu is gleeful about this because now there are people rallying around him. Because after the last election, his coalition, nor the other side, it was against him, had enough seats to become prime minister, because you have to have 61 seats in the Knesset.
Right.
And he couldn't form that coalition. So now you have the other side, a man named Yair Lapid, who had a chance to form his coalition. So this happens in the middle of it. But you make a great point, though, about that group called Jewish Power. That's their name in English. It's like white power. They are a Jewish supremacist group, very anti-LGBT, horribly anti-women. They want to expel Arabs from their land. Their leader of the group, Ben Gvir, one of his heroes is a man named Barak Goldstein, who slaughtered over 20 Palestinians in Hebron at a mosque, and he loves that guy. He's dressed up as him in Purim, which is a Jewish holiday. That's how much he loves him. He puts a picture up. Netanyahu, that's his partner. That's his partner that he ran with. This is unreal. So if Netanyahu becomes prime minister again, and that man is in the coalition, which he will be in his party called Jewish Power is in it, I think Americans might finally ask questions about, does our aid go to support a government like that, with that kind of composition, that kind of vileness in it? I mean, Netanyahu's a racist, but at least he gave lip service to Palestinian rights, and at times was fair at times to Israeli Arabs. This guy, his coalition partner, no, not at all. So it really is like Trump emboldening the worst in America with good people on both sides and stand back and stand by for the Proud Boys. That's what this Jewish Power group is like. And now Netanyahu's not just emboldening them, he's welcoming them. They're part of his governing coalition if he becomes prime minister again. Yeah, it's amazing stuff. Dean Obeidallah on Sirius XM every night, weekdays 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Sirius XM Progress Channel 127. DeanofRadio.com is his website. Dean Obeidallah on Twitter. Dean, thanks a lot for dropping by. Thanks very much, Tom. Good talking with you.
Listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And I'll be picking up your phone calls right after this break. Stick around. And welcome back. Brian in Anaheim, California. Hey, Brian, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I am really concerned about this climate crisis that we're in right now. I don't think the term climate change does it justice. We need to start using the phrase climate crisis.
Agreed.
And hopefully Congress and the media will pick up on it. So one of the things you discuss in Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, which everybody listening should absolutely read, is that we are running out of fossil fuels or ancient sunlight and doing so far faster than we're currently funding green alternative replacements. And the reason that things don't look that horrible for us on the outside right now is in terms of a fossil fuel shortage crisis is because, like so many of those .com startups at the turn of the century, we're very much living on borrowed capital. So the truth about what is essentially the planet's financial situation, just like theirs wasn't, isn't blatantly apparent.
Well, there was also a technological bump, fracking basically, gave renewed potential to the fossil fuels. But to your point, Brian, where are you going with this?
Well, I want to know, is there, as much as I'd love to have the general public ultimately, know about this, it's going to be Congress who decides what is going to be legislated. Do you think Congress itself is adequately educated with regards to this? And if not, do you know if there's any kind of organized lobbying effort that we can support financially, those of us who believe in this, by those who are aware, like, you and Dr. Michael Mann, that to educate congressional representatives of the degree to which we are in great danger of really breaking the bank when it comes to our fossil fuels and how urgent it is that we fund green alternatives.
To the best of my knowledge, Brian, the United States is literally the only developed country in the world that has a political party that denies the reality of what you and I are talking about, you know, this climate crisis that we're experiencing.
It's like 60% of the Republicans in Congress, I think, something crazy like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's nuts. And it's more or less the official position of the Republican Party. You know, no need to do anything about this. You know, our biggest donations come through Charles Koch and his friends, and a lot of these guys made their fortunes in oil and continue to. And so, you know, there's nothing to see here. Just keep on moving. No droids in this car. And it used to be that there were, you know, a few Democrats who were along for that ride. To the best of my knowledge, there are no Democrats left who are climate deniers. So,
is Joe Manchin on board? I know he takes a lot of money from coal.
You know, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. But I would be astonished if Joe Manchin was a climate denier. I'm just genuinely astonished. So that said, I think that, you know, the number one thing that we need to be doing is everything we can to get Democratic majorities, governing majorities, particularly at the federal level, right now, and that's, you know, good old-fashioned activism.
Not just vote, but get out the vote.
Yeah, and talk about, you know, climate as a crisis, and point out that, at least for the Republicans, this is a partisan issue. And therefore, for all of us, it's a partisan issue. And, you know, if you're concerned about the fate and future of this planet, or the fate and future of your children and grandchildren, or even yourself, if you expect to live more than another 20 years, or maybe even a decade, well, hell, for that matter, we're experiencing climate crisis right now. I mean, you know, it's like,
yeah, it's already started.
Yeah. It's like, look at the wildfires, and, you know, you live in California, I live in Oregon. I mean, you know, this is climate change that's doing this, and, you know, not to mention the derecos and the hurricanes, and there's now a giant typhoon that is formed in the Pacific. Yeah, I think that's what we need to be doing. Brian, I got to run. I'm sorry. We'll be right back. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So David Perry over at Medium.com put together a list of 38 reasons to investigate the Trump administration. Everything from the Russian influence over the 2016 election, to the Trump family's collusion with Russia, to Ivanka Trump's trademarks, to federal spending at Trump properties, to the civilians killed by Trump's drone strikes, to the Trump administration's role in turning the United States into the global epicenter for the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, we are. Yes, it's grim. Their decision to sideline the CDC, politicizing mask wearing just to try to get himself reelected, the number of people who died because the White House kept PPE from blue states, from Democratic-led states, the contents of the Trump documents that Trump refused to release to the House Judiciary Committee and other committees, all the people who wouldn't speak, at all, ignoring subpoenas, violations of the Hatch Act, the deportation of COVID-positive immigrant families, illegal altering of records. Anyhow, there's a whole list. It's over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you and George in Chicago. Hey, George, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. This is a difficult subject, and I hope you bear with me because I have a hard time articulating this, even formulating it in my mind. But my starting point is our founders, who had the perception that church and state must not mix. Every time they do, there's disaster. The second is that 2,000 years ago, when the Roman Empire was the legitimate political authority at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and the rules of the game in statecraft were might makes right, and that's what was recognized throughout the world. The constantly rebellious Jewish population was put down and was scattered throughout the empire. Now, what happened to the Jewish people in the intervening years, particularly in World War II, is a horror beyond horrors. And I have some connection to this, though I'm not Jewish, because my extended family that's from Poland and Russia were horribly impacted. Some of them wiped out by the Nazis in World War II, some of them broken in concentration camps. And yet, a political decision that was made 17 or 1800 years prior to the late 40s should not have been remedied by forcing a new nation on a part of the world where it had not been in 1800 years. What underlied establishing Israel at that time was largely religious, that it was the homeland given to the Jews by God. And our Constitution doesn't allow for those considerations. We do not allow an established religion. Now, all the nations of the world failed the Jewish people in the 30s and 40s, and the Jews who had been displaced should have been funded and supported in every way to go back to the farms and towns and cities and institutions that they had lived in and been part of before the war. I think the last 3/4 of a century has demonstrated that the imposition of Israel on the Eastern Mediterranean has been an endless set of problems and war and bloodshed, and there does not seem to be any solution to the problem. Where we go from here, I don't know. I'm not wise enough to know. But the mistake was made 3/4 of a century ago, and the whole world's been paying for it ever since.
Yeah, George, I get what you're saying, and I think that the idea of ethno-states, essentially, Israel's not the only one. You've got numerous states that declare themselves to be legitimate because they are Islamic states, for example, or because they're principally made up. In fact, the only people who could become citizens are of a particular lineage. I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, several of the countries in the Middle East. It's a challenge because having an ethno-state, having a state that's core, singular, foundational, I don't know what the word is, the center of it essentially, is a religion or a genetic lineage, is in some ways so spookily similar to what the white supremacist movement in the United States is trying to bring about here, which is a white Christian ethno-state, that it should give us all pause on the one hand. On the other hand, Israel it has been there since 47 or 48. It's not going away, and I think that putting any discussion of it in this larger context, is an interesting academic exercise, but I don't think that it's going to help this process. We don't have a time machine. We're not able to create Israel someplace other than where it was created. Like, for example, I don't think anybody would have been able to argue if a chunk of Germany had been sawed off and said, okay, this is the new homeland for Jewish people. Although, again, you'd be creating an ethno-state. But we were all horrified by that. But none of that matters at this point. What we've got to do now is figure out how can the United States, as a principal, one of the beneficiaries of Israel, or Israel's a benefit, we provide some benefits to Israel. How we're going to continue to interact with them as they essentially become more and more a right-wing apartheid state. We went through this with South Africa years ago. Reagan was, gung-ho for apartheid, and I think we're going through it again. And it's difficult, it's troubling, it's challenging, and I have no easy answer either, George. I mean, that was, I guess your point at the end was that you don't have an easy answer. I have none either, but we just can't walk away from it. We can't. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More information at hellofresh.com, code TOM. CB Distillery for sleeping and pain relief. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. Annie's Kit Clubs, creativity delivered right to your door. More info is available at annieskitclubs.com/Tom. EasyFlow, personal air filtration system. Fresh air anywhere. More info at easyflowusa.com, code TOM. Masterclass with world-class instructors. More info at masterclass.com/Hartman. And Dinovite, only the best all-natural pet supplements. More info at dinovite.com.
We say fight back!
We're reading today from Guns for Hire, how the CIA and U.S. Army recruit mercenaries for white Rhodesia. It's a historical reprint of what appears to be a 1979 pamphlet, basically. This is from the introduction. It does have an ISBN number. It is available in book sources. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, actually this must have been published post-1980 because they're referencing Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, 270,000 white settlers, mostly immigrated since World War II, controlled the government and economy, ruling over the 7 million black Africans. The Zimbabweans cannot vote. They have been forced off the bulk of the arable land, and they have no democratic rights whatsoever. All labor performance in Zimbabwe is black labor, and it is intensely exploited, often at less than subsistence wages. Zimbabweans have been fighting European invaders since the early 17th century. Since the 1890s, they have been directly ruled by Europeans, at first in the form of a private British corporation, the British South Africa Company. Since 1923, direct political rule has been in the hands of the white settlers, currently led by Ian Smith and his fascist Rhodesian Front Party. It's important to note that the white settlers were originally given this direct local power as a, quote, self-governing colony of the British government, thereby creating a master-caretaker relationship. During these past 80-odd years, Western imperialism, the multinational corporations of the United States, Britain, and South Africa, has extracted huge profits from the exploited and oppressed Zimbabwean population via the subsidiaries of the Anglo-Americans, Lonrho, Amex, AMAX, Union Carbide, Mobil, ITT, and other corporations. They fully intend to continue doing so as long as they can. The white settler minority has been rewarded for their violent subjugation of the Zimbabwean people with perhaps the highest national standard of living in the world. Sir Roy Walensky, the former Prime Minister of the Central African Federation, which included what is now Rhodesia, once said, "This man Smith has an appeal. It's the appeal of an easy life. For $6,000 a year, you can have 5 servants, a swimming pool, and a lot." Beginning during the early 1960s, however, the Zimbabwean nationalist forces under the leadership of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, evolved the strategy of guerrilla war to liberate their people and land. It is proving to be very successful. There are 20,000 guerrillas in base camps in Tanzania and Mozambique, over 3,000 in Zimbabwe itself, and this number is continually rising. In a meeting between Stephen Solars, a U.S. congressman, and the ZANU guerrilla leaders, they were reported to reject the possibility of enlisting the assistance of Cuban or other foreign troops, declaring that if we cannot liberate ourselves, we do not deserve to be liberated. Despite Western propaganda to the effect that the U.S. and British only wish to avoid a bloodshed in Rhodesia. Don't forget the Zimbabweans have been bleeding for almost a century. Their real fear is that the liberation struggle will win. With this victory in sight, it is not surprising that the counterattack by the Smith regime has become more vicious and brutal. Actually, this must have been published pre-1980, because this is when Smith was still in power in Rhodesia. More than 250,000 rural Zimbabweans have been forced into concentration camps. Terrorist raids have been conducted against Zimbabwean refugees in Mozambique. Dusk to dawn shoot-on-sight curfews have been instituted and enforced in the border areas. And escalating counterinsurgency attacks have been launched against the military arm of the liberation struggle, the Zimbabwean People's Army, ZIPA. It is crucial for Westerners to understand that the Smith regime has not stood alone in this barbaric campaign. This pamphlet documents the critically important element in U.S. imperialism's support for the Smith regime, white mercenary reinforcements for the fascist Rhodesian, quote, security forces. This flow of U.S. mercenaries to prop up white Rhodesia is an important, though secret, part of U.S. imperialism's strategy for Africa. The U.S. has massive investments in southern Africa. Zimbabwe alone supplies the bulk of high-grade chrome ore used in the U.S. for jet engines and other advanced technological items. Coal, copper, and other minerals are ripped out of Zimbabwe for U.S. industry. Mobil Oil, Texaco, Hertz Rent-A-Cars, Holiday Inns, and many other U.S. corporations operate illegally in Rhodesia through foreign subsidiaries. More important still is South Africa, the fortress of U.S. interests in Africa, where $1.5 billion is invested by GM, IBM, Ford, and other giant multinational corporations. The liberation of Zimbabwe would, for the first time, penetrate the buffer zone of satellite countries protecting the borders of South Africa. South African guerrilla fighters, who are already training by the thousands in camps in Tanzania and Zambia, would have direct access to re-enter their land and accelerate the liberation struggle. Knowing that the stakes are high, U.S. imperialism has worked to strengthen the white supremacist outposts in Africa, although at times this had to be done covertly. In 1970, the Nixon White House approved Henry Kissinger's Operation Tar Baby strategy, based on Option 2 of the Secret National Security Study Memorandum Number 39. This strategy essentially called for covert military assistance, including direct exchanges, so the South African troops could be trained in the U.S. in specialized tactics and weapons. This would be done while the U.S. tried to convince Africans that it was on their side. This is from the pamphlet number 39, that Kissinger memorandum. We would maintain public opposition to racial oppression, but relax political isolation and economic restrictions without openly taking a position undermining the United Kingdom and the UN on Rhodesia. We would be more flexible in our attitudes toward the Smith regime. And it goes on from there. Guns for hire.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is the senior economist for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which he co-founded back in '99. The author of several books. This is Dean Baker, the author of several books, including Rigged, How Globalization and the Rules of the Modern Economy Were Structured to Make the Rich Richer. You can read his blog at Beat the Press. CEPR.net is the website for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR.net. And you can tweet Dean at DeanBaker13. Dean Baker, welcome back to the program. It's been a long time. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm curious your thoughts, as both an economist and as an observer of the political scene and a very thoughtful commentator on how these rules are structured and how they work. On Jerome Powell and the Fed.
Well, hey, Tom, thanks for having me on first. But I've been writing about this recently. I, of course, have been following the Fed closely for more than a quarter century. I think Jerome Powell's really made a sea change at the Fed. He's made a commitment to full employment and basically shifted the priorities of the Fed in a very, very fundamental way. So for decades, the Fed's view has been that they're concerned about inflation and employment was at best secondary. And there have been many times, I could go through, you don't want to hear me go through all the times, but there have been many times where the Fed raised interest rates to slow the economy, mean fewer jobs, throw people out of jobs, or keep them from getting them, in order to preemptively prevent inflation.
Right. And Dean, if I could interrupt, isn't the legal mandate, I mean, literally the law that created and essentially regulates the Fed, doesn't that literally say that the Fed has two equal purposes, to maintain full employment and to basically control inflation? I think it's more like, maintain the integrity of the money supply.
Absolutely it does. And it absolutely does. And this is one of the things that's striking, that in spite of that legal mandate, the people at the Fed perceived their policy, their obligation as being to control inflation. And I did a blog post last week, or maybe the week before, where I recounted this meeting I had back in 1994 with Alan Blinder and Janet Yellen, two very liberal, decent people. I respect them both. And I was there with two colleagues, and we were arguing that the Fed should put off raising rates, because we knew that they were planning on raising interest rates because the unemployment rate was falling, and it was hitting levels that at least many economists felt would cause inflation. And we were trying to argue, why don't you wait? Why don't you wait? You could see if there's a problem with inflation. Why don't you wait? You'd let millions of people get jobs. And Alan Blinder said to me, well, the Fed is an institution that's committed to price stability. And I said, well, you're committed to 4% unemployment, because that was in the law at the time. And he said, no one takes that seriously.
Whoa.
And then I said, well, you don't have to take the commitment to price stability seriously. And then he goes, yes, I do.
Yeah, so the thing that haunts me about all this, Dean Baker, there was a quote, I used it as an epigraph for one of my books. I think it was Screwed. But it was a quote that was in the Wall Street Journal with Alan Greenspan in 1997, where he said that his job, or the job of the Fed, the job of the Fed chair, is to maintain, and I think I'm quoting this, it's been a lot of years, but I think I'm quoting it accurately, to maintain a certain minimum necessary level of worker insecurity so as to avoid wage inflation, or words to that effect. And so it's not just like reducing inflation, it's like preventing wage inflation. In other words, preventing wages from going up as well.
That's right. And that really had been, I mean, that was Greenspan, of course, the chair, and he's just one of the members of the Open Market Committee that determines the Fed's interest rate policy. But he was enormously influential and pretty much always got his way. And he was quite explicit. He didn't want to see wages rise too rapidly, and he acted to prevent wages from rising too rapidly. And again, that had been the policy at the Fed really until Jerome Powell. Now, they moved away from it a little bit, in fairness. I mean, his predecessor, Janet Yellen, of course, is now Treasury Secretary. I think he had moved away from that some. And but so there had been progress previously. But Jerome Powell really is a sea change, and quite explicitly saying, look, we want to have very low unemployment, because when we have low unemployment, that means people that are ordinarily discriminated against the labor market, blacks, Hispanics, people with criminal records, they're able to get jobs because that's who's out there. And he said that's a good thing. And that's a real sea change from where we were, certainly with Greenspan, but even to some extent with Janet Yellen.
So did we... forgive my complete ignorance about this, but I thought that Jerome Powell was still running the Fed. I thought that there had, that was just a continuous process. Is he not? Has he left the Fed?
He's still running the Fed. His term will expire in January of next year.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Biden will have to make a choice as to whether to reappoint him or not. Now, there is somewhat of a tradition of reappointing Fed chairs even by the other party. So when Obama came in 2008, he, of course, had to deal with Bernanke, who was President Bush's appointee. He did reappoint him. And then subsequent to that, of course, you had Yellen picked as Bernanke's replacement. Trump departed from tradition and chose to pick Jerome Powell instead. But there had been a pattern. Greenspan was appointed by several presidents, both Clinton and the first Bush and Reagan. It goes back to Reagan.
Dean, a question here. I'm sorry to be kind of breaking in and moving along, but we just have about 2.5 minutes here until we hit a hard break. I was quite critical of Jerome Powell during the Trump administration because the Fed was basically creating money out of thin air and using it to buy stocks and bonds of corporations. It looked to me like they were artificially holding up the stock market. Was I wrong in that perception and in that critique?
They weren't buying stock. They did buy bonds, and that did help support the stock market. It also brought down interest rates, and
corporate
that
bonds.
made it easier for people to borrow across the board, particularly homeowners. A lot of people refinanced to lower interest rates. When you're facing a recession, it's hard to see an argument as to why you'd want higher interest rates. And,
right.
You know, some people were upset about that, but I'm about as anti-corporate as you get in general. I don't see that as having been the wrong move.
So you think Powell was doing essentially the right thing throughout the Trump administration? It was not, his behavior was not influenced by, I mean, you know, if he believes in full employment, he believes in full employment. It wasn't just that he was trying to do something because Trump told him to.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if there was any direct influence from Trump, or for that matter, even indirect. I mean, Trump was very unhappy with him for much of his tenure, and there was some talk that he would have Powell fired, and it's not clear that he could. But in any case, I doubt very much that anything that Powell did was directly or indirectly influenced by what Trump may or may not have wanted him to
Dean,
do.
in our last minute, is there any way beyond, you know, picking good people as Fed chairs to force the Fed basically to have as their principal focus employment rather than inflation?
Well, sure. I mean, the Congress does have oversight. Also, I've worked with this group, Fed Up, a labor and community group, that we pressured the Fed, and I'd like to think we had some role in getting them to change their position. But Congress does have oversight, and at the end of the day, the Fed is governed by a law that Congress passed. So it could, in principle, change the law to make it very clear that its top priority has to be full employment. So they are a creature of Congress. They're answerable to Congress.
Yeah. Do you see that happening? Is there any kind of movement toward that in Congress?
There had been in times past, but I think if you have a Fed that's committed to full employment, I think it's harder to get the momentum to look to try to change the Fed's mandate. If you're in a different story, then maybe yes.
I get it. Fascinating stuff. Dean, thank you so much for dropping by and clarifying so many of these issues for us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great talking with you, and keep up the great work. The website again, cepr.net. It is well worth your efforts. Dean Baker. We'll be back. We're going to drop in with David Sirota in a minute.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
David Sirota is going to drop by about the resurrection of Reagan's welfare queen. This is pretty shocking, and I'll be picking up your phone calls too. So stick around. And welcome back. Grant in Ventura, California. Hey, Grant, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Tom, I'm relating to a previous caller who talked about the shortage of fossil fuels and climate change. And what I find is that even though Democrats do not deny climate change, they do deny the link between climate change and militarism. And we're now in 36 conflicts around the world. Our U.S. military uses about 52% of all fossil fuels used by this country. So my question is, when are we going to start reframing these conflicts in terms of climate change? When will we see our wars for profit as corporatized military-induced climate change?
Grant, I knew that the military was the largest single consumer of fossil fuels in the United States, even more than cars or homes. In these all these individual categories. I didn't realize it was 52% of all fossil fuels. Can you give me a source for that?
I can't give you a source for it. I would say go to petroleum use in the United States. Mm-hmm. I think that's where I got the source for that.
In either case, I agree with your premise, your basic whether the statistic is accurate or not. Go ahead.
And the reason why military uses so many fossil fuels because they depend on fossil fuels, number one, and it's jet fuel that uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuel.
In the refining process, and also they fly a lot of jets.
When you see those Tic Tac skies where we do jet practice flights across the sky, they're using in those few flights that you might see in a week, that uses all the fuel that you and I use in a year.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're
so that's an example of a tremendous amount.
And I live in our studio is on, we're several miles away from it, but we're on the glide path for the Portland airport, and because we're right by the Columbia River, and it's amazing when the National Guard jets are practicing. It usually starts about 20 minutes after we get off the air, thank goodness. But they are so loud. It's like, they're basically just giant high-powered jet engines. Grant, in terms of your original question, which is how do we start reframing the military and militarism and conflict around the world as a climate change issue, I think the conversation you and I are having is a good start. I think that, it's an area that I didn't discuss in Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight or Last Hours of Humanity, the books that I wrote about climate change, and should have. And it's a good topic for a future rant, certainly. But I think that the main thing would be to be contacting members of Congress, Democrats who claim to be concerned about climate change, and point out to them that the single largest consumer of fossil fuels in the United States is the military, and conflicts all around the world are adding to that, horribly, in fact. Grant, thanks for the call. I appreciate it. And thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. I'll be back in just 1 minute after I read an ad over on the commercial side of this program. And David Sirota is going to drop by, and we're going to talk about the resurrection of Ronald Reagan's welfare queen. Oh, my God. We'll be right back. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. We have a new video up over at ThomHartmann.com about conspiracy theories. Abby Richards came up with a kind of a hierarchy of conspiracies, maybe a variation on the old Maslow hierarchy. And it goes from actual conspiracies to maybe this was a conspiracy, maybe not, we have questions, to this is kind of crazy stuff, but who knows, flying saucers, for example, to actual science denial, conspiracy theories that actually serve to promote the interests of a particular industry or wealthy individuals, to the totally crazy stuff, the flat earth, the reptilian overlords and all that kind of thing, conspiracy theories that can do tremendous damage. And, one of those being one of the conspiracy theories that, brought two Republicans into Congress this year. So anyhow, I lay the whole thing out with a new video for our supporters over at ThomHartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, the founder of the Daily Poster, dailyposter.com. David Sirota, also magazine editor at Jacobin and The Guardian, a columnist with The Guardian, and in fact, for many years, one of my colleagues as a talk radio host, and is with us. Dailyposter.com, as I mentioned. You can tweet him at David Sirota. David, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we've talked, and I appreciate you dropping by. I subscribe to your newsletter over at dailyposter.com, and this rant you went off on about the resurrection of Reagan's welfare queen just popped my eyeballs. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, and thanks for having me on, Tom. I mean, the resurrection of the rhetoric that suggests that jobless people who are getting unemployment benefits, expanded unemployment benefits, that these are people who are lazy, these are people who are turning down work, these are people who are hurting the economy by supposedly not coming back to work, to jobs that they're being offered. this has been resurrected, and it's being portrayed as something new. But, of course, as you allude to, it's some of the oldest rhetoric that we've seen in the book. I mean, this was the premise of Ronald Reagan's campaign in 1976 and in 1980, where he was berating supposedly overly generous government benefits. And the Republicans have now resurrected this rhetoric, and there's an agenda behind it, just like there was under Ronald Reagan. We've heard this line that, people aren't coming back to work because the unemployment benefits are too good. And what that's really designed to do is to try to get people back into jobs at low pay. In other words, the donors to the Republican Party don't want to allow the labor market to work in a way that employers have to raise wages to attract workers. So when people are hearing the notion that jobless people are not coming back to work and there's a supposed labor shortage, what's really being said is that the Republicans don't want to have their donors have to pay workers better to attract them back to work.
So it's essentially the new welfare queens are the people who are on unemployment. The new god-awful, government, let's hold them in bondage forever. This is the Republican theory, right? Group are the people who are trying to, help people through the pandemic. David, we had Pramila Jayapal, Representative Jayapal, on the program just a little earlier, and she pointed out that the science is pretty much in, the political science, as it were, and the economic science, that the reason people are not that there seems to be a shortage of workers right now, the principal reason that there seems to be a shortage of workers right now, is that women aren't coming back into the workplace because their kids are not going to school or daycare, because we still, only a third of America is fully vaccinated. We still have a crisis going on here, CDC guidelines notwithstanding. How do you see, I realize this has really seized control of the Republican Party. We've got, we have multiple states now where governors have said, okay, we're just going to end the unemployment benefits because the states ultimately have final say on these things, even though they're federal benefits flowing through. How do you see this shaking out within the Democratic Party? You're a keen observer of this. You were a speechwriter for Bernie Sanders. You've been around the block a few times here in this world. And what can we do to support Democrats who want to make sure that we still have an intact social safety net?
Well, it's a really great question, and Pramila Jayapal is absolutely right. I mean, Census Bureau data tells us that the primary reason, or at least one of the huge reasons, that people are not coming back to work is because of the pandemic, and they have kids at home. We also have, by the way, it's worth adding, that 43% of small businesses have admitted in a recent survey that people aren't coming back to work, or they're having trouble finding workers because of people's need for child care and because people are searching for better paying jobs. I mean, let's take a moment to realize that when the Chamber of Commerce, or when Republicans say an additional $300 a week is why people are not coming back to work because they're seeking better pay, they're basically admitting how terrible the pay is and how terrible the wages have been in America for decades. Now, your question about Democrats is a great one. So far, Joe Biden and the Democrats in Congress have been pretty good. I mean, the stimulus bill that extended unemployment on that score was a good bill and good spending. The thing that to watch, though, is that you saw last week, you saw Biden say that he's going to help states toughen up the work search requirements for unemployment benefits, which is, Joe Biden, and look, Joe Biden back in the Reagan era, let's be clear, Joe Biden was echoing a lot of that welfare queen rhetoric, that really grotesque rhetoric.
A lot of Democrats were,
A lot of Democrats were. And look, he's not saying what the Republicans are saying, so he's better than them. But the thing to be concerned with is if he's trying to appease the Republicans with that rhetoric and surrender that argument, that's a bad sign. So I think people should be contacting their members of Congress, telling them not to give up on those benefits and not to accept the premise that Republicans are putting forward.
Amen. Amen. David Sirota. And one of the best things on the web that you can check out is dailyposter.com. Check out David's publication. David, thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate it.
It's
Program.
great talking with you. We'll be right back.
9925.
Oop, I'm stepping on my own liner here. We'll be right back with your calls after this. Stick around. Hey, it's Thom Hartmann. We're reading from A Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right in today's Thom Hartmann University Book Club. This is from Chapter 11, page 271. The official opening of the 112th Congress took place on January 5th, 2011, when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, handed off an oversized ceremonial gavel to her successor, John Boehner. But a new era of ultra-conservative billionaire influence had already begun. Before the public swearing-in ceremony got underway, David Koch, whose donor network had spent at least $130.7 million on winning a Republican majority, was in the new Speaker-to-be's office, ornate office, chatting amiably with his staff. The People's House was under new management, and critics would suggest new ownership. While Koch was a very public presence on the Capitol, his political adjutant, Tim Phillips, the president of Americans for Prosperity, was deep in the inner sanctum of the congressional committee that mattered most to the bottom line of Koch Industries. Phillips's most important destination that day was the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which under the new Republican majority had now increased its power to block President Obama's environmental agenda in Congress. The committee could bury progress on climate change and harass the EPA for the foreseeable future. And then just jumping through a little anecdote about Lee Fong and David Koch, they continue. In Plutocrats, the rise of the new global super-rich and the fall of everyone else, journalist Krista Freeland describes how those with massive financial resources almost universally use them to secure politics and policies beneficial to their interests, often at the expense of the less well-off. In the United States, a number of studies have shown that in recent years, this tendency has distorted politics in very specific ways. In a study he conducted for the nonpartisan Sunlight Foundation, the political scientist Lee Drutman found that increasingly concentrated wealth in America resulted in more polarization and extremism, especially on the right. Very rich benefactors in the Republican Party were far more opposed to taxes and regulations than the rest of the country. He discovered the more Republicans depend upon 1% of the 1% donors, the more conservative they tend to be. The 112th Congress soon unfolded as a case study of what David Frum, an advisor to the former President George W. Bush, described as the growing and, in his view, destructive influence of the Republican Party's radical rich. The radicalization of the party's donor base, he observed, has propelled the party to advocate policies that were more extreme than anything since Barry Goldwater and his 1964 presidential campaign. It also led Republicans in Congress to try tactics they would never have dared use before, end quote. Hard data supported this. Harvard's Theta Scott poll found that the House took the biggest leap to the far right since political scientists began recording quantitative measurements of legislators' positions. There was no better example than the Koch's newly won influence over the House Energy and Commerce Committee. In the previous Congress, the panel had been chaired by Henry Waxman, a liberal Democrat from California, who had quarterbacked the House's successful passage of the cap and trade bill, only to see it die in the Senate. Now the new Republican leadership stocked the committee with oil industry advocates, many of whom owed huge campaign debts to the Kochs. Koch Industries' PAC was the single largest oil and gas industry donor to members of the panel, outspending even ExxonMobil. It had donated to 22 of the committee's 31 Republican members and 5 of its Democratic members, too. In addition, 5 out of the 6 Republican freshmen on the committee had received outside support from Americans for Prosperity. Meanwhile, many of the new committee members had signed an unusual pledge swearing fealty to the Koch's agenda. They promised to vote against any kind of carbon tax unless it was offset by comparable spending cuts, an unlikely scenario. The no climate tax pledge was invented by Americans for Prosperity in 2008, when the Supreme Court cleared the way for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases as it does other pollutants. The Koch's pledge was modeled on the enormously successful one that the anti-tax crusader Grover Norquist had used to intimidate Republican lawmakers from raising taxes. But in this instance, it served not a cause so much as a company. By the start of the legislative session in 2011, fully 156 members of Congress had signed the Koch brothers' no climate tax pledge. Many returning members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee had already taken the pledge, and of the 12 new Republicans on the panel, 9 were signatories, including 5 of the 6 freshmen. A prime example of the symbiotic relationship between the Kochs and the committee was Morgan Griffith, who had defeated Rick Boucher in the district that represented Saltville, Virginia, and was among the new wave of appointees to the Energy and Commerce Committee who were openly indebted to the Koch brothers for their seats. Americans for Prosperity operatives were guests of honor at a victory rally soon after the election, at which Griffith gushed, quote, "I'm just thankful that y'all helped me out in so many ways," end quote. The Koch's investment soon paid off. Once in office, Griffith became an outspoken skeptic of mainstream climate science, drawing national ridicule for lecturing scientific experts as they testified before Congress that they needed to consider the possibility that Mesopotamia and the Vikings owed their success to global warming, and the melting ice caps on Mars showed that humans were not its cause on Earth. Congressman Griffith became a lead player in the House Republicans' war on the EPA, demanding that the agency be reined in. Within a month after he took office, he and other House Republicans gutted the EPA budget by a punishing 27%. Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right by Jane Mayer. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So there's a new study that has, this is not peer-reviewed, but it is in preprint. It is being peer-reviewed as we speak, where the scientists were looking at the ability of the COVID virus to jump from the human species. You know, it started with bats, and then it apparently went to pangolins and then to humans. To jump from humans to other species, which would be a big problem. If we can infect other mammals, you know, our cats and dogs, if we can infect rats or mice, who have traditionally been disease vectors for all kinds of things, from the bubonic plague to hantavirus, if we can infect them with this virus, we've got a whole brand new problem. And sure enough, they have found that these 2 variants, B351 and P1, both can infect mice in the laboratory. And they say this abrogation of the species barrier represents, you know, a serious problem. It's over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And boy, is there a lot in the news. Well, we covered quite a bit of it actually in the first hour. I think one of the most amazing things is that Axios just published this today, that Donald Trump, the day after he lost the election in January of this year, basically tried to rig the American military so that Joe Biden would inherit an absolute screaming disaster. And in some cases, the military guys talked him out of it. In other cases, they said, okay, I'm working on it, and then they just didn't do it. You know, and in other cases, like he wanted, you know, all U.S. troops out of Europe, right? Get the last American troops out of Germany. And like, well, okay, we'll have to, you know, it's going to take, we can't do that in 2 weeks, sorry, you know. And just pull us out of Afghanistan right now. Just let the whole country collapse. And not that our being there is preventing the collapse, you know, but get us out of Afghanistan. And the way that they were able to talk him out of pulling out of Afghanistan immediately was saying, you will leave behind billions of dollars worth of equipment. We at least need the time to take our assets, our things that are worth money, and bring them back to the United States. And Trump was like, oh, they're worth money? Oh, well, okay, I guess we better protect those. The guy has the comprehension, the worldview of a 3-year-old. I mean, it's just, anyhow. Let's pick up your phone calls here, the last half hour of the program. David in Possum Kingdom Lake, Texas. Hey, David, what's up?
Hi, Tom.
Hey.
For some time, you have been saying that the Congress can add a line to a bill that says the Supreme Court can't rule on it. And you and Pramila Jayapal earlier were lamenting the possibility that the Supreme Court might strike down, I think it was the Voting Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering why neither one of you mentioned that.
Well, I'm guessing that the reason she didn't is because conventional wisdom in this country that is shared by pretty much every politician I've ever met is that if Congress was to mess with the Supreme Court, even though they have the power under Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, that would be a breach of American tradition. Now, I wrote an entire book arguing that that's not a breach of American tradition, that we've had several presidents who have literally completely ignored orders from the Supreme Court. Andrew Jackson, twice, once with regard to the U.S. Bank, the second bank of the United States. The other time with regard to the Trail of Tears. In both cases, the Supreme Court said, you can't do what you're talking about doing. And he said, you know, screw them, I'm going to do it myself. And then you had two cases where President Abraham Lincoln ignored explicit orders of the Supreme Court. One having to do with habeas corpus during the Civil War, and the other having to do with Dred Scott. And Lincoln basically said, you know, it's a terrible thing that the court ruled against Mr. Scott, and he's stuck being a slave again. But we're just not going to recognize that as a universal proclamation. So he kind of, you know, cut the baby down the middle. But that was 170 years ago. And or 160 years ago. And so it's been a long, long time since Congress stood up on their back 2 feet and took on the court. The last time that there was even a serious attempt was 1937, when Franklin Roosevelt decided that he was going to challenge the court, and by adding some members to it, you know, the so-called packing the court. But I would love to see it happen, David. And I think that, you know, in fact, I love your suggestion. I think you just gave me my rant for one day this week, or my op-ed for one day this week, that the Congress really needs to think about adding a court stripping, it's called court stripping, a court stripping provision to legislation like H.R. 1 that says that this legislation is not subject to judicial review. It's not subject to review by the Supreme Court.
Bill?
Well, you know, I think if they did it with every bill, that you know, they would certainly be consistent with the worldview and the understanding of the American Constitution of about half the founders and framers, most notably Jefferson. But they would also be outside the parameters of the other half. So I doubt that they would do that. But
why would we favor the bad half?
Well, because you do want, you know, there have been times when the Supreme Court has looked at law and said, you know, that's not good law. And, you know, for example, of course, these are the examples liberals always use. 1954, Brown v. Board, 1972. Say that again?
You always say that Congress can decide that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, I know my own arguments here, David. I'm with you. I just, you know, it would be jumping into the deep end of the pool rather than stepping into the shallow end and getting used to the temperature of the water. But I think it's a great rant. David, thank you for that. That was a very thoughtful call and spot on. Erica in Seattle. Hey, Erica, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hey, Tom. There were a couple people earlier that were talking about climate change, and I volunteer for an organization called Cascadia Climate Action here in Seattle. And when I became involved several years ago, I was really just very depressed about climate change. So I decided to become involved with this organization, and it really helped me a lot to find ways and things to do to get involved. So I just wanted to, because people often focus on, you know, the terrible things that are happening, and there's so many ways for people to get involved. So I just wanted to mention 4 quick ways people can get involved to do something about the climate crisis. So the first is work with others, attend a meeting, and connect with organizations that have an approach that fits you. The second is support a critical action, find a high priority action taking place, and attend a march or a rally. Learn more about climate issues, attend lectures, panel discussions, and presentations. and comment on agency action, influence agency decision-making with your oral or written input. So those are some simple things that people can do to get involved, and all you need to do is pick one thing.
Yeah, it's great therapy, if nothing else. In addition to really moving the United States in the proper direction. So thank you for that, Erica. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Edward in Columbus, Ohio. Hey, Edward, what's on your mind today?
I wanted to talk about the January 6th insurrection.
Mm-hmm. Go for it.
What I got out of that was that the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, all of these white supremacist groups, they're just the military arm of the Republican Party.
Yep.
They work.
Paramilitary is the correct term, Edward.
Paramilitary?
Yeah. It's not an official military, but it functions like a military. The brown shirts were Hitler's paramilitary. The black shirts were Mussolini's paramilitary. The death squads were the paramilitary for the El Salvador government. And here in the United States, the paramilitary arm of the Republican Party is, the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters, and there's a whole bunch of these groups. Yeah.
Right. And I think that the next strike is going to be on the Black Lives Matter movement after the judge renders the sentence of the cop up in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's going to come up with a very light sentence to provoke the Black Lives Matter groups out into the streets. And I think that's where the Proud Boys are going to get with the police. And I think we're going to see some of the biggest massacres in the history of this country.
It's not. Well, number one, I'm not sure that that judge is that politically motivated or that racially, has that much racial animus. It's not impossible, of course, this being America. But your larger point that any kind of an event that might get people into the streets, a George Floyd kind of event happening someplace, anywhere else in the United States, that might get people out in the street, could provoke an armed paramilitary response that would be a slaughter. The closest we've gotten to this so far is one kid, being driven by his mother up to Minnesota to murder two people and blow the arm, or nearly blow the arm off the third. I think it's well taken. And the good news is that the federal government is starting to take this seriously. For the first time, frankly, in my lifetime, that right-wing terrorism. There was Bill Clinton sort of reacted, against Terry, what's his name? And Terry Nichols. Thank you, Sean. Yeah.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
I see that as problematic, and I'm at least comforted that the DOJ is taking this stuff seriously. And welcome back. Let's see here. Bill in Seattle. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind today?
Yes, I would like to talk about the withdrawal of the troops.
Mm-hmm. From Afghanistan?
No, from the world.
Oh, okay.
Why do we have 800 bases in 100 countries in the world?
Yeah, well, because we are, or were, the world's preeminent empire as a consequence of World Wars I and II.
Okay, so why are they still there?
Because we have found it profitable to be empire. We have found it politically useful. Our politicians have found it politically useful. I think that that is fading rapidly, Bill, that sentiment. And I think that Donald Trump, in fact, tapped into a vein of that, when he said time to pull out of the rest of the world. And I think that the days of America being empire are numbered. If you look at how the British Empire unwound, there's basically two ways countries go from being empires to just being countries. And one way is to do it carefully, methodically, over a period of typically a decade or two, which is what the United Kingdom did after World War I. And they, because they used to have colonies all, half of Africa was a British colony. I worked in Uganda, which used to be, and I worked in Kenya, which used to be a British colony. And for that matter, I've worked in Australia, which used to be a British colony. And so Great Britain, over a period starting at the end of World War I and really finished by the mid-1950s. I think it was 1956 or 57 was the year that they finally pulled out of Uganda, and that was one of the last ones. And India also, as a result of Gandhi. So that's how you do it in an orderly fashion. And my hope would be that the United States does that. The way you do it in a disorderly fashion is when you get your ass kicked.
There's so much money being made, they're not going to.
Well, they will if there's enough political pressure, Bill, and that's our job. And that is to be bringing up this issue with our politicians, to be saying, American empire, enough. Chester in Beaumont, Texas. Hey, Chester, what's on your mind?
Oh, hi, Tom. Thank you for taking my call. First time to call.
Thank you.
The conversation you were just having with the person prior to the one you just had was about, global warming and the reasons for having things to do to stop this global warming. And I say the number one thing is to vote, and you just mentioned it there.
Yes.
And so that's really all I have to say. Yeah.
Well, you said it very well, Chester, and your point is well taken. And I think that was kind of the subset of at least two of the 4 points that caller made. I didn't write them down, so I can't, quickly reference them off, but I think you're absolutely right. We have to be politically active. We have to be, as, per the last caller, if we want to end American empire and have America just go back to being a country, like the United Kingdom has done, by and large, step one is let your politicians know. And also, if you want to do something about climate change and reducing the footprint of our military, as an earlier caller, made the point very eloquently. We have all been Googling, looking for the statistic, and they can't find it. The U.S. military does consume like 12 million gallons of fuel a day, but beyond that, our military footprint is contributing to global climate change, too, all around the world. Another good reason to end empire. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Ask a boomer what it was like going to college back in the 60s and 70s and whether they had to go into debt to do it. And odds are they'll tell you that they not only didn't have to go into debt, in fact, college was free in California until Ronald Reagan became governor. Not only did they not have to go into debt, but, you could pretty much work your way through college just with a part-time job. That is very much no longer the case. Only 8% of millennials and Gen Xers have never had a student loan. This is a crushing burden on these two generations, and it's time to clean it up. And when Americans were asked, what do you think? Should we just wipe the slate clean? Should we get rid of all this student debt? 60% of Americans said yes. And then, of course, the corollary to that would be, and then let's make college free, at least state colleges and community colleges. There's a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com for supporters of our program. You can check it out there. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And let's see here. Cindy in Morton Grove, Illinois. Hey, Cindy, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. Honored to be on. I've been trying to get on for a few years. Thanks for everything you do. So I have a unique perspective. Earlier, you were talking about that $300 extra unemployment payment. Mm-hmm. So I have a very small business, small brick-and-mortar store in a summer tourist town. So I'm busy 4 months out of the year, summer and Christmas. And we're just going into our 9th year. And finally, at least pre-COVID, the last few years, I was finally turning a little profit where I could pay myself something. Not a lot, maybe $15,000 a year, maybe $20,000 a year, just It's been slowly gaining.
I've been there.
Well,
in fact, every business I've started, I've paid myself zero for at least the first 2 years.
Right. Well, I did for like the first 6 or 7 years. So now fast forward to now and the situation we're in. Yes, I agree. I wish after Reagan and trickle down and all that stuff that didn't work, I wish we didn't slide into no more middle class and wage stagnation and all that. But we are where we are now, and we can't. The big corporations can afford to raise wages, but little mom and pops like me can't. I'm in a town where minimum wage is $9.25 an hour, also very low cost of living, and I pay really well at $11.50 to $12.50 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
But after July 15th, when we reopened after COVID last summer, I couldn't get anybody to come back and work because of this unemployment payment. I don't understand why they weren't paying that to me, the small business owner, so that I could pass it along to my employees, so that I could stay in business, and they would have that extra money to pay for child care.
That's how they did it.
They wanted.
That's how that is how it was done in all the European countries. I know that's how it was done in Australia. I have a friend who lives there. I know that's how it was done in Israel. There are pretty much every other country in the world made those payments through the businesses. In other words, they supported the businesses. And to keep their employees employed, even though they weren't working. And I'm with you on that.
Where we go from here?
Well, where we're going to go from here, Cindy, is that over the course of the next 2 or 3 months, you're going to see that $300 a month bonus, as it were, expires in September. And I would be astonished if it gets renewed. I realize that there will be people pushing to renew it. Bernie has already kind of come out and said, I'm going to lead that. But I would be astonished if that gets renewed. And at that point, it's going to be tight enough to be on unemployment. And Illinois, like I'm pretty sure pretty much every state in the union, limits unemployment benefits now to a certain period of time, to a year, or in some cases, in some states, 2 years. But it's not like you can go on unemployment for the rest of your life. So, you're going to have financial pressure that's going to bring people back into the workplace. And I get that. And, it's just incumbent upon, I think, every business to say, how can we do our business? But, I have no magical answer for you, Cindy, but I get where you're at. And thank you for the call. Johan in Los Angeles. Hey, Johan, what's up?
I want to talk about that you talked about welfare queen earlier this hour.
Yeah.
I think Republicans are the real welfare queens and crybabies, since they're getting all the millions and billions of dollars from the corporation without doing anything. And they're crying foul every time when Democrats or people of the poor try to get something from government.
I do find this logic that the Republicans have really fascinating, that if we give people a social safety net, if you provide people with health care, if you provide them with food stamps, or if you provide them with unemployment benefits, it's going to cause them to become lazy. But if you give benefits to CEOs, if you can help them raise their pay by 30% this year, or you can subsidize their company with a few $1 billion and they can, give themselves a huge bonus, somehow that makes them work harder. That rich people, when you give them extra money, they work harder. Poor people, when you give them extra money, they work less. It's a bizarre kind of logic that just makes no sense to me at all. So, Johan, thank you. Well said. James in Spokane. James, we have just about a half a minute to the end of the show today. You had a quick comment about World War II?
Well, actually, a couple of historical facts I can fit in here, I think, about corruption in government high office related to the Kennedy assassination. In the 3 years period followed the murder.
James, my apologies. I was off by at least 25 seconds here in my reading of my own clock. Call back anytime this week, and we'll get you back on. James, my apologies. Thanks so much for being with us today, and we'll be back tomorrow, back in the studio again. Kind of reminds me of an old Firesign Theater song, back in the saddle again. Anyway, in the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you So get out there, get active, tag You're It. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More information at hellofresh.com, code TOM. CB Distillery for sleeping and pain relief. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. Annie's Kit Clubs, creativity delivered right to your door. More info is available at annieskitclubs.com/Tom. Easy Flow, personal air filtration system. Fresh air anywhere. More info at easyflowusa.com, code TOM. Masterclass with world-class instructors. More info at masterclass.com/Hartman. And Dinovite, only the best all-natural pet supplements. More info at dinovite.com.